My name is Harper, 33 years old, and my mother secretly copied my apartment keys to move my sister in while I was at work. I pretended not to know and made a single phone call. Moments later, after a sharp knock at the door, the police rushed in. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic relatives who thought they could walk all over you. It had been a brutal 2 weeks in Chicago auditing a corrupt corporation. My brain was fried from tracing offshore accounts. All I wanted was to step into my quiet, immaculate apartment, pour a generous glass of vintage Cabernet, and sleep for 12 uninterrupted hours. My sanctuary was on the 20th floor, secured by a customized smart lock I had installed myself. But when I stepped off the elevator, the heavy oak door was slightly ajar. Muffled hip-hop music and obnoxious laughter drifted into the quiet hallway. I pushed the door open and stopped dead in my tracks. My pristine, carefully curated sanctuary looked like a hurricane had just hit it. Lounging on my white Italian leather sofa was Marcus, my sister's husband. Marcus was a smooth-talking African-American man who pitched himself as a visionary tech entrepreneur, though he never held a legitimate job. Right now, he was wearing my custom silk bathrobe stretched tightly across his broad chest. He was casually eating pistachios, cracking them open with his teeth, and dropping the empty shells directly onto my imported wool rug. He barely glanced up from the massive television, complaining loudly into his headset that my internet was too slow for his gaming. Before I could process the blatant disrespect, a loud crash echoed from my master bedroom. I marched down the hallway and stood in the doorway, paralyzed by the sight. My younger sister Jessica, the undisputed golden child of our family, was knee-deep in my walk-in closet. She was carelessly ripping my tailored suits and expensive designer dresses off their velvet hangers and stuffing them aggressively into black plastic garbage bags. Her own cheap fast fashion clothes were already piled high on my premium mattress, threatening to stain the white duvet cover. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked, keeping my voice deceptively calm. Jessica rolled her eyes, tossing another one of my silk blouses onto the floor. "Making room," she huffed, not even bothering to look at me. "Your closet is full of boring office wear anyway, Harper. You do not need all this space just to go type numbers into a computer." The clinking of glass drew my attention back toward the kitchen. My mother Brenda emerged holding a crystal glass filled with my most expensive vintage red wine. She took a long, satisfied sip and smiled broadly, as if she were greeting me at a casual neighborhood barbecue, instead of standing in the middle of my ransacked home. "Oh, good, you are back early," my mother said breezily. I stared at the wine, then at her. "How did you get in here?" "My door requires a biometric scan or a highly encrypted passcode." My mother waved her hand dismissively, spilling a few drops of red wine onto the hardwood floor. "I took that spare physical key you gave me for emergencies and made a copy last month when I came to water your plants. Good thing I did too. Your sister and Marcus are going through a rough patch with their lease. Marcus is launching his new tech startup, and he really needs high-speed internet to pitch to investors. Your apartment has the best connection in the city, so it just made sense for them to stay here for a while." I looked back at Marcus, who was now filming himself on my sofa, bragging to his followers about his new penthouse view. "You moved them into my home without asking me," I stated, the reality settling over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. "It is not a big deal, Harper," my mother scolded, her tone shifting to that familiar condescending edge she always used to keep me in line. "They are taking the master bedroom since they are a married couple, and Marcus needs a quiet background for his important meetings. You are single and barely home anyway. You can sleep on the couch, or just get an air mattress for the den," Marcus shouted from the living room, not bothering to turn around. "Come on, sister-in-law. Family helps family. Do not be so selfish and narrow-minded. When my app takes off, I will buy you a whole new house." My mother nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. You are 33 and still single, just crunching numbers all day. You should be grateful you finally have some vibrant life in this empty, lonely place. Now be a good sister and go get us some takeout. Marcus is starving." The old Harper, desperate for her mother's approval, would have cried and begged, but I was no longer that girl. My job as a forensic accountant required me to dismantle complex financial crimes by finding the tiny details that arrogant criminals overlooked. I looked at the pistachio shells grinding into my rug. I looked at my delicate silk bathrobe on Marcus. I looked at my mother sipping my wine. I smiled brightly. "You are totally right, Mom," I said, my voice smooth and entirely agreeable. "I am sorry for overreacting. Let me just wash my face in the bathroom and then I will order whatever you guys want." My mother beamed. "That is my good girl." I stepped into the guest bathroom and locked the door securely behind me. My smile vanished instantly. I pulled my phone from my pocket and bypassed my lock screen. I did not call the police to report a simple break-in. That would only result in a messy domestic dispute. Instead, I opened the secure application, connected to the hidden high-definition cameras I had installed in every room of my apartment months ago for insurance purposes. I scrolled back through the footage from earlier that afternoon. My blood ran cold, and then a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. On the glowing screen, I watched Marcus dragging heavy, unmarked crates into my guest room. When he pried one open, the camera caught a crystal-clear shot of the contents. He was not setting up a startup. He was unloading hundreds of blank magnetic stripe cards and illegal credit card skimming terminals. I was running a massive identity theft ring right out of my apartment, planning to use my secure IP address to hide his digital footprint. I tapped a specific number in my contacts. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, zooming in on the high-definition footage. Marcus was not just moving a few boxes around. He was dragging heavy military-grade Pelican cases across my reclaimed oak floors, the metal corners scraping deep permanent gouges into the wood. The camera angle from the ceiling corner gave me a perfect, unobstructed bird's-eye view of the guest room. When he pried the lid off the first black crate, my breath hitched in my throat. Rows upon rows of blank white plastic cards gleamed under the harsh overhead lights. Right beside them sat compact, sophisticated pieces of machinery. My mind, trained for years in forensic accounting, corporate auditing, and fraud detection, categorized the hardware instantly. Magnetic stripe encoders, deep insert ATM skimmers, RFID cloaking devices, and bulk chip cloners. He was not launching a visionary tech startup like he claimed. Marcus was setting up a full-scale federal-level identity theft operation. And he was doing it right here, routing his entire illegal network through my enterprise-grade, heavily encrypted IP address. It was a masterclass in parasitic behavior. If the federal authorities traced the digital footprint of this operation, they would not find a chronically unemployed grifter with a history of bad credit. They would find a senior forensic accountant at a top-tier financial firm. He was using my spotless professional reputation as his human shield. "Harper, wrap it up in there." My mother's fist pounded aggressively against the bathroom door, rattling the brass hinges. "Marcus needs to take a hot bath to decompress. Moving is highly stressful, and you are being incredibly selfish, monopolizing the only decent bathroom in this place." I closed my eyes and let the sheer absurdity of her demand wash over me. She had broken into my home, given my master suite to her unemployed son-in-law, and was now demanding I vacate my own bathroom so the man running a federal felony out of my guest room could take a relaxing soak. "I am almost done, Mom," I called back, keeping my voice light, breathy, and utterly compliant. "Just organizing my toiletries so Jessica has more counter space for her cosmetics." "Well, hurry it up!" she snapped from the hallway, her voice muffled but sharp. "You know Marcus gets severe migraines when he is overworked. He spent all afternoon carrying those heavy servers for his new business. The least you can do is be accommodating. He is the man of the house now." I looked back down at my phone screen. The live camera feed showed Marcus meticulously plugging a bulky data encoder into the wall outlet, completely oblivious to the small black dome blinking silently above the smoke detector. I minimized the security application and opened my encrypted messaging platform. I selected a contact saved simply as Detective Reynolds' Fraud Division. Detective Reynolds and I had collaborated on 3 massive corporate embezzlement cases over the past 4 years. He knew my meticulous nature, and he knew I never sent false alarms. My thumbs flew across the keyboard with clinical precision, drafting the message. "I have an active large-scale credit card, skimming and identity theft ring, Operating out of my guest room right now. Suspect is currently on site handling the equipment and blank magnetic cards. Federal felony quantities. Come heavy. Come fast. I hit send without hesitation. A read receipt appeared almost instantly on the screen, followed seconds later by three simple words. Units en route. I locked my phone and slipped it deep into my pocket. I reached for the flush handle on the toilet, letting the loud sound of rushing water mask the deep, steadying breath I took. I turned to face the mirror above the sink. The woman looking back at me was a high-powered corporate auditor who could trace a single missing dollar through a labyrinth of shell companies. But I needed them to see the Harper they had conditioned for 33 years. The quiet, obedient scapegoat who always swallowed her pride to keep the family peace. I relaxed my shoulders, softened my sharp gaze, and painted a mild, accommodating smile onto my face. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway. My mother was standing there with her arms crossed, glaring at me disapprovingly. I slipped past her with a murmured apology and walked into the living room. Jessica was struggling to lift a heavy cardboard box overflowing with my expensive winter coats. She let out a dramatic, exasperated sigh, dropping the box heavily onto the floor. A cashmere trench coat spilled out, accumulating dust from her dirty sneakers. "These are so incredibly heavy," Jessica whined, massaging her perfectly manicured hands. "Why do you even own so many coats, Harper? You only ever go to the boring office. You do not have a social life." I stepped forward and effortlessly hoisted the box into my arms. "Let me get that for you, Jess," I said, carrying my own winter wardrobe toward the front door to be discarded. "You have always had a bad back. I remember when we were teenagers, you could not possibly carry your own laundry upstairs." Jessica smiled, completely missing the loaded history in my words. "Exactly. You are always so much better at the heavy lifting. Just put them by the trash chute later. I need the closet completely empty by tonight. Marcus has a lot of expensive inventory coming in for his big launch." I set the box down near the entryway and turned my attention to Marcus. He was still sprawled across my sofa, intensely focused on the video game blaring on my massive television. The delicate silk fabric of my bathrobe strained dangerously against his shoulders as he reached blindly for another handful of pistachios. I walked over and began neatly stacking the scattered coasters on the coffee table, playing the perfect subservient host to perfection. "So Marcus," I said, keeping my tone casual and bright, "your new tech startup seems incredibly hardware intensive. What time exactly are your business partners arriving to check out all those blank credit cards and magnetic stripe encoders in the guest room?" Marcus froze. His hand halted halfway to his mouth, a pistachio trapped between his fingers. The video game character on the screen died with a loud digital groan, but Marcus did not blink. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes wide with sudden paralyzing panic. The arrogant, untouchable swagger evaporated in a fraction of a second, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a cornered criminal realizing he had made a fatal miscalculation. Before he could formulate a single defensive word, before my mother could ask what I was talking about, before Jessica could complain about the noise disrupting her unpacking, a sound echoed through the apartment. It was not a polite tap or a casual ring of the doorbell. It was a heavy, authoritative window, rattling, pounding, that shook the solid oak of my front door in its frame. The shout was a booming command that paralyzed everyone in the room. Before Marcus could even process the words, a heavy ram shattered the door lock I had just installed. The heavy oak door slammed open, rebounding off the wall with a deafening crash. A wave of tactical officers flooded into my living room, their dark uniforms and tactical gear, a stark contrast to my pristine white decor. "Get down! Get on the ground now!" The officers fanned out with military precision. Marcus dropped his gaming controller. The plastic device bounced off the coffee table and clattered onto the floor. For a split second he stood frozen, his eyes darting frantically from the heavily armed officers to the front door, realizing his escape route was entirely blocked. Panic overrode his logic. He spun around his bare feet, slipping on the polished hardwood, and made a desperate sprint toward the glass balcony doors. He did not make it 3 steps. 2 officers launched forward, hitting him squarely in the midsection. They tackled him to the floor, taking down a side table and shattering a crystal vase in the process. Marcus hit the ground hard, his face pressed directly into the pile of pistachio shells he had just discarded. "Stop fighting! Put your hands behind your back!" an officer shouted, pinning Marcus down and securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. Jessica began to scream. It was not a normal scream, but a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed off the high ceilings. She dropped the garbage bag full of my clothes and rushed toward the living room, her face pale with terror. She watched in absolute horror as the officers hauled her husband to his feet, his hands bound behind him, my custom silk bathrobe now torn and sliding off his shoulder. "What are you doing to him?" Jessica shrieked, batting at an officer who stepped in her path. "He did not do anything. Let him go." Brenda hurried out of the kitchen, her wine glass abandoned on the counter. She took one look at the tactical officers, the handcuffs on Marcus, and the team already moving down the hallway toward the guest room. The officers kicked the guest room door open immediately, shouting "Clear," as they secured the crates of credit card skimmers and blank magnetic cards. Brenda instantly understood what was happening. She knew Marcus was running illegal scams, and she knew the authorities had just caught him red-handed. But instead of shock or shame, my mother went into pure survival mode. She did not hesitate to throw me straight under the bus to protect her precious son-in-law and her favorite daughter. "Officers. Thank God you are here," Brenda yelled, raising her hands dramatically and pointing a trembling, accusing finger directly at my chest. "She is the one you want. Take her, she owns this apartment. This is her place. Whatever illegal things you just found back there, they belong to her. She is a criminal." I stared at my mother, marveling at the effortless ease with which she betrayed me. She did not even blink. She was entirely willing to send her own daughter to federal prison just to save Jessica from the embarrassment of having an incarcerated husband. Jessica immediately caught on to the narrative and chimed in, her fake tears flowing freely. "Yes, it is true. We just got here to visit her. We were just helping her unpack some boxes. We had no idea she was involved in anything illegal. Please, you have to arrest her." The lead detective, a tall man with a stern face and a tactical vest reading "Reynolds" across the chest, stepped forward. He unclipped a pair of handcuffs from his belt and walked directly toward me. His expression was grim and unreadable. He stopped 2 feet away, the heavy metal cuffs clinking in his hands. "Ma'am, is this your primary residence?" he asked, his voice low and commanding. My mother nodded vigorously, stepping closer to ensure the detective heard her clearly. "Yes, it is her primary residence. We are just innocent guests. Read her her rights, officer. Get this criminal out of my sight." I did not flinch, I did not cry, and I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my high-resolution tablet, tapping the screen to wake it up. "Detective Reynolds," I said, keeping my tone crisp, professional, and completely devoid of panic. "My name is Harper. I am a senior forensic accountant for one of the largest corporate auditing firms in the city. I hold advanced clearances for federal financial investigations. I am well aware of what is inside that guest room. In fact, I am the one who texted you 20 minutes ago to report it." My mother let out a loud, mocking scoff. "Do not listen to her lies. She is trying to frame my poor son-in-law." I ignored her entirely, swiping past my lock screen and opening my firm's encrypted cloud server. I turned the tablet to face Detective Reynolds. "What you are looking at is a live digital chain of custody," I explained, pointing to the data streaming across the screen. I suspected Marcus was using my home IP address to mask his illegal activities, so I installed a network monitor. I also placed hidden cameras in the guest room. This footage shows Marcus physically hauling the crates of illegal skimming devices into my apartment exactly 42 minutes ago. I tapped the screen again, pulling up a secondary document. Furthermore, I ran the license plate of the vehicle Marcus arrived in through a public database. I cross-referenced it with toll booth camera timestamps, proving he transported the stolen goods across state lines this morning, elevating this from a local crime to a federal wire fraud syndicate. Here is the metadata, the video files, and the network logs proving he connected the encoders to my router. Detective Reynolds studied the screen intently, his eyes scanning the irrefutable evidence I had meticulously compiled. He nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the bulletproof presentation. He turned away from me and looked directly at Marcus, who was now sweating profusely, his eyes darting toward the floor. "Take him down to the precinct," Reynolds ordered his officers. book him for possession of credit card forgery devices, and initiate a federal hold. As the officers dragged a struggling, cursing Marcus toward the front door, Jessica realized her husband was actually going to jail. Her lavish lifestyle, entirely funded by his illegal scams, was vanishing before her eyes. The luxury cars, the expensive dinners, the image she projected to the world, it was all turning to dust. She let out a guttural scream of frustration. "Wait, you cannot do this!" Jessica yelled, stepping in front of the detective. "You cannot take him away, and you cannot kick us out. We have rights." Detective Reynolds sighed, clearly losing his patience with my family. "Ma'am, your husband is going to jail. As for you and your mother, you are trespassing in your sister's home. I suggest you pack your bags and leave voluntarily before I arrest you both for obstruction." Brenda grabbed Jessica's arm, her face pale with panic. "Come on, Jess. Let us just get our things and go to a hotel. We will call a lawyer from there." But Jessica was not done. Her eyes narrowed into vindictive, hateful slits as she glared at me. A twisted, triumphant smile slowly replaced the panic on her face. She reached into her expensive designer purse and pulled out a neatly folded stack of heavy bond paper. She snapped the paper open and shoved it directly into Detective Reynolds' chest. "We are not trespassing," Jessica sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "And you cannot make us leave. This is a legally binding residential lease agreement for this exact unit. It lists Marcus and me as the primary legal tenants. And look right there at the bottom, officer. That is Harper's signature transferring the lease entirely to us. She has no right to kick us out. This is our apartment now." Detective Reynolds took the crisp document from Jessica, his expression hardening as his eyes scanned the heavy bond paper. I stepped forward to look over his shoulder. It was a flawless forgery. The dates were perfectly aligned, the legal jargon was entirely accurate, and right there on the bottom line was my exact signature. My mother had always hoarded my old tax returns, bank statements, and school forms. She had clearly traced my signature with predatory, practiced precision. Reynolds let out a heavy, frustrated sigh, the sound echoing loudly over the chaotic noise of the police raid. He folded the paper and handed it back to a smug Jessica. He looked at me with genuine regret in his eyes, the kind of look a seasoned cop gives when his hands are completely tied by bureaucratic red tape. "Harper, I am sorry," Reynolds said, his voice dropping to a professional monotone. "My jurisdiction covers the federal wire fraud and the possession of skimming equipment. I can take Marcus down to the precinct right now and process him for the felony charges. But this lease agreement makes the housing situation a civil dispute. As far as the law is concerned tonight, they have documented proof of residency. I cannot legally evict them from the premises. You will have to take this up with housing court on Monday morning." Jessica let out a sharp, victorious laugh that grated against my ears like shattered glass. She did not even glance at her husband, who was currently being dragged to his feet by two heavily armed tactical officers. "Wait, what about me?" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with panic, as the reality of a federal prison sentence crashed over him. "Jessica, call a lawyer. Get your dad to wire some money. Get me out of this." Jessica waved her hand dismissively, already inspecting a minor scratch on her manicure. "Do not be so dramatic, Marcus. You got sloppy with your little business venture, and now you have to deal with the consequences. I am not ruining my night calling lawyers for a lost cause. Besides, Mom and I have a lot of redecorating to do." The tactical officers hauled Marcus toward the door, his protests echoing down the hallway until the heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, cutting off his desperate pleas entirely. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and suffocating. I stood in the center of my living room, surrounded by the wreckage of my sanctuary. The police had confiscated the illegal equipment, but the damage to my home remained. My mother slowly walked back into the kitchen, her posture radiating arrogant triumph. She picked up the crystal glass she had abandoned earlier, filled it to the brim with my vintage wine, and took a long, satisfied sip. "Well, that was certainly an exciting evening," Brenda said, her voice dripping with sheer venom. She leaned against my marble countertop, looking at me as if I were a stranger who had just tracked mud across her pristine floor. "I must say, Harper, calling the police on your own brother-in-law is a new low even for you. You have always been so bitter and jealous of your sister." Jessica walked over and stood beside our mother, crossing her arms over her chest. You really thought you were so smart, didn't you? Harper Jessica sneered. You thought your silly little accounting job made you untouchable. You thought you could just kick us out into the cold because you think you are better than us. But you are just a lonely, miserable bean counter. And now you do not even have a place to sleep. My mother set her wine glass down with a sharp clink. Pack your bags, Harper. You have 30 minutes to get your things and vacate our property. I stared at them, absorbing the absolute audacity of their actions. You forged my signature, I stated, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. You committed felony fraud to steal my home. Prove it! Jessica shot back, a wicked gleam dancing in her eyes. The building manager processed the paperwork this morning. He took my cash deposit and stamped it himself. As far as the city is concerned, Marcus and I are the primary leaseholders. You are just an unwanted guest who has overstayed her welcome. Now go pack your boring little suits. I am sure there is a cheap motel off the highway that suits your specific tax bracket. The old Harper would have screamed. She would have cried, thrown things, and begged her family to see reason. She would have desperately tried to appeal to whatever tiny shred of maternal instinct Brenda possessed. But looking at the two women standing in my kitchen, utterly devoid of empathy or remorse, I realized there was absolutely nothing left to save. They were parasites, and they had just handed me the ultimate justification to burn their lives to the ground. I did not argue. I lowered my head, letting my shoulders slump perfectly to mimic absolute crushing defeat. I turned away from their gloating faces and walked slowly toward my master bedroom. I stepped over the black garbage bags filled with my expensive clothes. I opened my closet and pulled out a sleek, minimalist overnight carry-on. I did not pack my clothes or my jewelry. I meticulously packed my encrypted laptop, my backup hard drives, my power chargers, and a small leather folder containing my most sensitive financial credentials. I zipped the bag shut with a crisp final sound. When I walked back into the living room, Brenda and Jessica were already moving my coffee table, debating loudly whether they should throw my custom Italian sofa into the dumpster to make room for a cheaper sectional. They barely glanced at me as I walked toward the front door. Leave your keys on the counter, Brenda ordered, not even turning around to look at me. And do not bother coming back tomorrow. We are having the locks changed first thing in the morning. I placed the heavy metal key on the kitchen island. I opened the front door, stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway, and let the door click shut behind me. I walked toward the elevators, the soft hum of the building wrapping around me. I pressed the call button, and the stainless steel doors slid open. I stepped inside and watched my reflection in the mirrored walls. As the doors sealed shut, the mask of the defeated daughter melted away entirely. My posture straightened, my jaw locked, and a cold, calculating fire ignited in my chest. I did not press the button for the lobby. I did not go out into the cold night to search for a homeless shelter or a cheap motel. I pressed the button for the second floor, a restricted access level completely off limits to the general public and standard residents. The elevator descended swiftly and silently. The doors opened to a dimly lit, luxurious corridor lined with expensive artwork. I walked past the heavy glass doors marked Executive Leasing Office, ignoring the closed signs hanging in the windows. I approached a discreet security panel on the wall, pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner, and waited for the light to flash green. The heavy security door unlocked with a solid mechanical thud. I pushed the door open and walked directly into the massive, opulent back office. David, the senior property manager of the high-rise, was sitting behind his mahogany desk, reviewing a stack of late-night financial reports. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise as I walked in. He immediately stood up, smoothing his suit jacket with nervous energy. "Harper," he said, his voice rushing out in a hushed, respectful tone. "I did not expect you tonight. Is everything all right upstairs?" I walked right up to his desk, my heels sinking into the plush carpet. David had been the one to process the forged lease agreement my sister handed him this morning. But Jessica had made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation. She assumed David worked for a faceless corporate landlord. She did not know that 2 years ago I used my massive corporate bonuses to purchase this entire luxury high-rise through an anonymous holding company. She did not know that David was not just a leasing agent, he was my direct employee. "I need the master override keycard," I said, my voice echoing coldly off the walls of the executive office. David did not hesitate. He opened his top drawer, retrieved a sleek black keycard emblazoned with the building's gold crest, and handed it to me across the desk. I took the card, feeling the heavy plastic between my fingers. I looked David dead in the eye and delivered my instructions. Time to initiate the emergency fumigation protocol on floor 42. David swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he processed the chilling weight of my command. He did not ask questions. He immediately turned to his computer terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard to initiate the automated building-wide maintenance sequence for the 42nd floor. I did not wait to watch him finish the override protocol. I turned on my heel, the heavy black keycard cool against my palm, and walked straight toward the private express elevator reserved exclusively for executive ownership. The stainless steel doors glided open, and I stepped inside, pressing the unmarked top button. The elevator launched upward in near silence, leaving the chaos of the lower floors far behind. When the doors parted, I stepped into the sprawling 4,000-square-foot penthouse suite. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. The space was immaculate, furnished with imported Italian leather, dark mahogany accents, and a profound, unbroken silence. It was a stark contrast to the apartment my mother and sister were currently ransacking directly below me. I dropped my modest carry-on bag onto the polished marble floor and walked straight to the massive glass desk dominating the home office. I flipped open my encrypted laptop, letting the bright blue glow of the monitor illuminate the darkened room. My fingers moved with practiced relentless speed as I bypassed multiple security firewalls to access the primary financial database for Apex Horizon Holdings. As the highly restricted portfolio loaded onto the screen, a grim smile played across my lips. For years, my family had openly mocked my career. They dismissed my punishing 60-hour workweeks, laughed at my dedication, and constantly degraded my profession as being nothing more than a boring, invisible desk job. They had absolutely no idea that 2 years ago, my firm had rewarded me for dismantling a massive multinational Ponzi scheme with a corporate auditing bonus, so obscenely large it felt completely surreal. I did not buy designer handbags or flashy sports cars to impress people who fundamentally disrespected me. I used every single penny of that bonus to quietly purchase this entire luxury high-rise in cash, shielding the transaction behind a web of anonymous corporate holding companies. I was not a tenant facing eviction. I was the landlord. Every resident, every maintenance worker, and every property manager in this building answered directly to me. But that brought a glaring problematic variable to the forefront of my mind. David had processed that forged lease agreement. He had taken the paperwork from Jessica and officially logged it into the municipal housing registry, legally transferring my residential unit to her and Marcus. David knew perfectly well who actually owned the building. He was a coward, but he was not stupid. He would never risk his lucrative salary and his professional licensing without a massive, irresistible incentive. I leaned forward, cracking my knuckles, and launched my proprietary forensic tracking software. I linked directly into the building's internal financial servers, pulling up David's comprehensive employee profile and his linked banking credentials. It took my algorithm less than 4 minutes to find the glaring anomaly. There was a sudden, completely unexplained deposit of $25,000 sitting in David's secondary offshore checking account. The transaction was timestamped at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, just 2 hours before Jessica and Marcus arrived at my door with their moving boxes and a moving truck. I locked onto that digital thread and began to pull mercilessly. The bribe money had been routed through a seemingly untraceable digital wallet, bounced across 3 separate dummy corporations in Delaware in a desperate attempt to wash the origin point clean. It was a decent attempt at money laundering, perhaps sophisticated enough to fool a standard local police detective or a tired bank clerk. But I was the person who built the algorithms that caught Wall Street billionaires hiding their assets. I deployed a recursive tracing script slicing through the digital shell companies like a surgical scalpel. The progress bar raced across my screen, dismantling the final layer of financial encryption. The true source account flashed in bright, undeniable red letters. My breath hitched in my throat, a cold, sharp spike of betrayal driving straight through my ribs. The account did not belong to my mother, Brenda. It did not belong to my sister, Jessica, and it certainly did not belong to her grifter husband, Marcus. The $25,000 bribe came directly from a private wealth management account registered to Richard, my father. My father, the man who constantly lectured me at Thanksgiving dinners about the absolute importance of family loyalty and moral integrity, had secretly bankrolled the hostile takeover of my home. He had deliberately paid a corrupt property manager to accept a blatantly forged lease, actively enabling his golden child to steal my sanctuary and throw me out onto the street. He had funded my ruin just to make Jessica's life slightly more convenient. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, staring at the glowing red letters on my screen. My entire family had conspired against me. They had coordinated a ruthless tactical strike to strip me of my assets, completely confident that I would simply absorb the abuse and quietly disappear like the obedient scapegoat I had always been. The profound depth of their treachery completely eradicated any lingering shred of familial obligation I held in my heart. I reached for my coffee cup, preparing to initiate a complete digital freeze on David's accounts and authorize a swift, uncompromising eviction protocol for the trespassers currently celebrating on the 42nd floor. But before my fingers could even graze the ceramic mug, a piercing high-priority alert siren blared from my laptop speakers, a high-level monitoring script, which I had quietly attached to my parents' personal financial records years ago to protect them from identity theft, was flashing a critical red warning across the dashboard. I clicked the notification, expanding the real-time banking ledger. My eyes widened as I processed the staggering data populating the screen. Someone had just digitally authorized a massive, irreversible transaction against my father's primary assets. A brand new high-interest, $200,000 second mortgage had just been taken out against my parents' childhood home, and the entire sum of that mortgage had just been successfully wire transferred directly into a Cayman Islands offshore shell company registered exclusively to Marcus. The glowing red notification on my laptop screen burned itself into my retinas. $200,000. My father had leveraged the very roof over his head, the house he and my mother had owned for 3 solid decades, to bankroll a federal crime. I spent the remainder of the night meticulously documenting the digital paper trail. I packaged the routing numbers, the offshore account details, and the time-stamped wire transfers into a heavily encrypted read-only file. I knew the fallout would be catastrophic for them, but I felt absolutely no guilt. They had drawn the battle lines. I was simply executing the final maneuver. By the time the sun crested the city skyline, I was already dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, my armor for the day. I left the penthouse, bypassed the 42nd floor entirely, and took my private elevator down to the secure underground garage. The drive to the financial district was uneventful, a stark contrast to the hurricane of felonies my family had unleashed the night before. I parked my car and walked toward the towering glass facade of my firm. The morning air was crisp, the sidewalks bustling with ambitious professionals holding expensive coffees, and right there, pacing erratically near the revolving glass doors, was Richard. My father was usually a man who obsessed over optics. He prided himself on projecting the image of a dignified, successful patriarch. Today he looked like a cornered animal. His trench coat was deeply wrinkled, his face was flushed a dangerous shade of red, and his usually perfectly knotted silk tie was askew. The moment he spotted me blending in with the crowd of corporate executives, he stormed forward, physically blocking my path to the entrance. "Harper," he barked, his voice loud enough to turn the heads of several passing junior analysts. "What on earth is wrong with you?" I stopped, keeping a polite, impassive distance. "Good morning, Dad. I see you got Jessica's frantic phone call." He pointed a shaking finger at my face, completely ignoring normal social decorum. "You are going to march down to that police precinct right this second and drop these ridiculous fabricated charges against Marcus. You are going to tell those detectives it was a massive misunderstanding, and you are going to get my son-in-law out of a holding cell right now. Do you have any idea what you have done to your sister? She is hysterical." I crossed my arms, my expensive leather briefcase resting comfortably against my hip. "I did not do anything to Jessica, Dad. Marcus brought federal-grade identity theft equipment into my home. He brought hundreds of blank credit cards and skimming encoders into my guest room. I simply alerted the proper authorities to a felony occurring on my property. Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh of pure disbelief, throwing his hands in the air. Identity theft equipment. Do not give me that corporate nonsense. You are just too stupid to understand visionary technology. Marcus is launching a revolutionary payment processing startup. He has proprietary hardware. He pitched the entire business model to me last month, and it is absolutely brilliant. You just ruined the most crucial phase of his rollout because you threw a jealous temper tantrum over a spare bedroom. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling stale, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. You listen to me, Harper. I believed in Marcus so much that I cross-collateralized the family home. I took out a $200,000 second mortgage yesterday morning to serve as his primary angel investor. I put my own skin in the game because I actually support my family. I do not tear them down. The sheer delusion was staggering. He was standing outside my corporate office proudly admitting he had mortgaged his entire life to fund a grifter, while simultaneously scolding me for not supporting the family. You gave a chronically unemployed con artist $200,000 against the equity of your home, I asked, letting a trace of genuine pity bleed into my voice. Dad, Marcus does not have a startup. He has a criminal enterprise. Stop lying, Richard roared, spittle flying from his lips. You are just a bitter, selfish spinster. You sit alone in your sterile apartment crunching numbers all day, hoarding your little paychecks. You are completely empty inside, Harper. You are so intensely jealous of Jessica's happiness, so envious of her passionate marriage that you actually orchestrated this whole police raid just to ruin her life. You could not stand seeing her happy with a visionary entrepreneur while you die alone. I was projecting decades of toxic family dynamics onto the sidewalk, demanding I absorb his venom just as I always had. But the venom did not sting anymore. It just sounded pathetic. When I did not flinch, cry, or apologize, Richard resorted to his ultimate weapon. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up like a loaded weapon. I am giving you one final chance, Harper. He threatened, his voice dropping to a vicious, guttural hiss. You are going to call the precinct right now and bail Marcus out. If you refuse, I am going to walk right through those revolving doors. I am going to march up to the executive suite and demand a meeting with your senior partners. I will tell them you are unstable. I will tell them you stole family funds to buy your apartment, and that you are using your corporate connections to illegally harass your sister. I will make such a massive, ugly scene that your firm will have no choice but to terminate your employment to save their own reputation. I will destroy your career today. I looked at the phone in his hand, then up at his flushed, furious face. The man standing before me was not a father seeking peace. He was a desperate co-conspirator, trying to protect his disastrous financial investment by terrorizing his own daughter. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, entirely invading his personal space. He stiffened, clearly expecting me to beg or surrender. Instead, I calmly raised my hands. I reached out and grabbed the lapels of his wrinkled trench coat. With slow, meticulous precision, I smoothed the rumpled fabric over his shoulders. Then my fingers moved to his collar. I gently took hold of his crooked silk tie, shifting it until it rested perfectly centered against his throat. I patted his chest twice, locking my eyes onto his. You are incredibly stressed, Dad, I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and absolutely devoid of fear. And you should be. But you are directing your panic at the wrong person. He blinked, thrown entirely off balance by my serene composure. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice losing an ounce of its bluster. I let go of his tie and took a half step back, admiring my handiwork. I am talking about your brilliant angel investment, Dad. I am talking about that $200,000 second mortgage you took out on the house yesterday. I did a deep dive into the routing numbers last night. You did not invest in a revolutionary payment processing startup. You wire transferred those funds directly into an offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands registered exclusively to Marcus. Richard's jaw went slack. The phone in his hand drooped slightly. He opened his mouth to argue, to deny it, to call me a liar again, but I did not give him the chance. Marcus was not building hardware, Dad. I continued, my voice sharp and clinical. He was encoding stolen credit cards. He was operating a federal wire fraud syndicate, and you just became his primary financial backer. I forwarded the entire digital chain of custody, including your offshore wire transfer to Detective Reynolds and his federal counterparts at 6 o'clock this morning. They are not going to release Marcus. They are building a massive RICO case. Richard's face drained of all color, transforming from an angry crimson to a sickly, terrifying shade of ash gray. His chest began to heave as the reality of my words slammed into his stubborn pride. You might want to check your mobile banking app before you march into my office to cause a scene, I suggested, politely gesturing toward the phone still clutched in his trembling hand. Because you did not just fund a felony, Dad. You actively participated in it. And the FBI has just frozen every single bank account associated with your name. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, unable to formulate a single coherent syllable as the reality of his financial ruin crashed down upon him. I did not stay to watch him hyperventilate on the concrete. I turned my back, pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors of my firm, and left my father standing alone on the sidewalk. I bypassed my usual workstation on the 30th floor entirely. I took the secure executive elevator straight to the penthouse level, a floor reserved strictly for the senior managing partners. I did not schedule a meeting or ask the executive assistant for permission to enter. I pushed open the solid oak doors of the primary boardroom where the three men who ran the firm were reviewing their morning portfolios. They looked up annoyed by the sudden intrusion, but I did not offer any apologies. I walked directly to the head of the long mahogany table, plugged my encrypted flash drive into the presentation console, and brought the massive wall monitor to life. I did not hide my family drama or attempt to soften the embarrassment of my situation. I laid the data bare, stripping away all personal emotion and presenting the crisis strictly as a catastrophic corporate liability. Gentlemen, I said, my voice projecting crisp authority across the silent room. Yesterday evening, my residential property was subjected to a hostile takeover by a family member operating a federal wire fraud syndicate. That is a personal matter. However, this individual made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. While squatting in my home, he attempted to mask his illegal credit card skimming operations by piggybacking onto my secured work laptop. He actively routed his stolen data packets and fraudulent wire transfers through our firm's proprietary encrypted IP address. The annoyance on the partners' faces vanished instantly, replaced by cold, absolute alarm. By trying to hide his digital footprint, Marcus had effectively used our multi-billion-dollar financial auditing firm as a digital shield for a criminal enterprise. He had compromised our network security and invited a highly probable FBI raid directly onto our premises. I am not asking for personal time off to manage a family squabble. I continued, staring down the senior managing partner. I am demanding full, unrestricted authorization to weaponize this firm's entire legal and forensic infrastructure. I want to annihilate his network and hand him over to the federal authorities before they decide our company is complicit in his crimes. The senior partner did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He gave me a sharp nod, granting me immediate, unlimited access to the firm's aggressive legal team, our elite cybersecurity division, and a blank check to pursue the investigation to its absolute conclusion. Within 10 minutes, I had transformed a secluded executive conference room into a heavily secured war room. I turned my personal vengeance into a sanctioned, fully funded corporate crusade. With a dedicated team of aggressive junior analysts, forensic accountants, and corporate lawyers at my absolute disposal, I began to tear Marcus's financial web to shreds. Armed with unlimited corporate backing, I moved with ruthless precision. We identified every single dummy corporation Marcus had registered in Delaware. We bypassed his pathetic encryption protocols and froze the Cayman Islands' offshore accounts before his stolen funds could fully clear the international holding periods. We cataloged the stolen credit card numbers, traced the laundered cash, and handed the complete, neatly packaged digital evidence directly over to my contacts at the FBI. We effectively gift-wrapped Marcus for a 20-year federal prison sentence, completely insulating my firm in the process. But my investigation did not stop there. I turned my focus toward the initial funding source of Marcus's operation. I scrutinized the $200,000 second mortgage my father had so proudly bragged about taking out against his home. As I ran the loan origination documents through our proprietary verification software, a glaring impossible inconsistency leaped off the screen. Richard possessed terrible credit. His long history of bad investments, missed payments, and heavily leveraged assets meant that no reputable banking institution would ever approve a massive secondary loan against his property without a pristine high-earning cosigner. I pulled the digitized mortgage agreement directly from the bank's secure server, expanding the signature page on my monitor. There, resting directly below my father's signature, was my mother's name, Brenda. But Brenda had not used her own financial credentials to secure the money. She had not used her own ruined credit score. I stared at the high-resolution scan, the blood rushing in my ears as the pieces clicked into place. My mother had always hoarded my old tax returns and financial statements. She had used my full legal name, my flawless credit history, and my stolen social security number to act as the primary guarantor for the loan. She had forged my signature with the exact same practiced predatory perfection that Jessica had used on the fake apartment lease. My mother had committed aggravated identity theft and major bank fraud just to secure the startup cash for Marcus's criminal enterprise. The cold clinical reality of the law settled heavily over my shoulders. If the bank called the loan due to the fraud investigation, I would be held legally responsible for $200,000 of stolen money. But more importantly, if I handed this specific undeniable document over to the FBI agents currently dismantling Marcus's operation, the consequences would escalate far beyond a polite family disagreement. Aggravated identity theft, combined with federal wire fraud, carried a severe mandatory minimum sentence. If I made one phone call, Brenda would face 10 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary. I held the absolute power to physically incarcerate my own mother. I sat alone in the dim glow of the war room monitors, processing the staggering weight of my discovery. The silence was suddenly shattered by the sharp, persistent buzzing of my cell phone resting on the glass conference table. The caller ID flashed Brenda's name. I let the phone vibrate 3 times before calmly pressing the answer button. Harper, my mother sobbed through the speaker, her voice trembling with perfectly executed theatrical despair. Her fake crying was an art form she had honed over decades, designed to manipulate and control. Harper, please. Things have gotten so terribly out of hand. Your father is an absolute wreck. His bank accounts are frozen and Jessica is completely inconsolable. We are family. Harper and family shouldn't fight like this. Please just come over to the house tonight for a peace treaty dinner so we can fix this together. I did not accept the invitation to my childhood home. A controlled environment was absolutely essential for a negotiation with cornered predators. Instead, I dictated the terms, directing them to meet me at Le Petit Châtelet, an obscenely expensive Michelin-starred French restaurant in the heart of the financial district. If we were going to have a peace treaty, we would do it in a brightly lit, heavily populated public space, where forced social decorum would keep their screaming to a minimum. When I arrived, the hostess guided me to a plush velvet corner booth. Brenda and Jessica were already seated. They looked utterly exhausted, their makeup slightly smudged, yet their eyes darted around the elegant dining room with the frantic, calculating energy of trapped rodents. A fresh, untouched glass of expensive red wine sat directly at my place setting. Brenda immediately launched into her performance. She pressed a pristine white cloth napkin to the corner of her eye, squeezing out a single perfectly calculated tear. Harper, thank God you came, she whispered, leaning across the crisp white tablecloth. The police raid was absolutely barbaric. They battered down the door with their rifles drawn. Your sister was terrified. She has not stopped shaking since they dragged Marcus away in handcuffs. You have made your point, Harper. You showed everyone how powerful you are. Now it is time to stop this madness and bring our family back together. Jessica nodded, attempting to arrange her features into an expression of wounded innocence. It was completely traumatizing. I thought I was going to have a heart attack when those federal agents rushed the living room. You have to call the district attorney and tell them it was all a giant misunderstanding. Marcus was just trying to build a future for us. I sat down, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. I did not reach for the wine. You forged my signature on a lease agreement, Jessica. You bribed a building manager. Marcus brought federal skimming hardware into my home. There is no misunderstanding to clear up. Brenda let out a dramatic shuddering gasp, pressing a hand to her chest. Do not speak to your sister that way. We are extending an olive branch to you. We want to forgive you for escalating this situation. We ordered your favorite vintage. Drink with us, Harper. Drink to family, and let us figure out a way to fix this mess. Jessica leaned forward, her elbows resting heavily on the table. Her eyes dropped specifically to the encrypted leather briefcase resting on my lap. We can handle the police, Harper. We just need you to do one tiny thing to show us you are actually committed to making this right. Just unlock your phone. Open your security app and delete the hallway and living room camera footage from last night. If the digital evidence is gone, the police case falls apart completely. Hand me the phone, Harper. Let me press delete and everything goes back to normal. The sheer, unadulterated audacity was breathtaking. They were not asking for forgiveness. They were demanding I destroy federal evidence to cover their tracks. I looked down at the wine glass waiting for me. The restaurant lighting was dim, deliberately designed to create an intimate, romantic atmosphere, but the flickering candle on our table cast a very revealing glow. Right along the delicate crystal rim of the glass, barely visible against the dark burgundy liquid, was a faint powdery white residue. It was smeared slightly, as if someone had hurriedly wiped a crushed pill around the edge, hoping it would dissolve unnoticed. They did not want a peace treaty. They wanted me incapacitated, pliant, and easily manipulated into unlocking my device so they could wipe the evidence themselves. My heart slammed against my ribs, but my face remained an impassive mask of corporate detachment. I needed to act fast. I needed a physical distraction perfectly timed to disrupt their intense focus. I reached across the table, my hand moving deliberately toward the heavily loaded breadbasket sitting near Jessica's elbow. I feigned a clumsy sudden slip. My forearm crashed hard into the woven basket, sending it flipping violently across the table. Crisp baguette sourdough rolls and a heavy ceramic dish of whipped butter went flying directly into Jessica's lap. Jessica shrieked, jumping backward as the butter smeared across her expensive silk blouse. Brenda gasped, immediately grabbing her napkin and standing up to bat the falling breadcrumbs away from her own dress. For exactly 3 seconds, both of their eyes were completely diverted. My hand shot out like a coiled spring. I grabbed my tainted wineglass by the stem and seamlessly swapped it with Jessica's identical untainted glass. The movement was a blur of practiced, ruthless precision. By the time Brenda looked back up, both glasses were resting exactly where they belonged. I am so sorry, I said, my voice smooth and apologetic. My sleeve caught the edge of the basket. Jessica scowled furiously, scrubbing at a grease stain on her shirt with a napkin. Just forget it. Are you going to unlock the phone or not? I picked up the clean glass of wine, raising it slightly in the air. Let us drink to family first. First, I suggested, meeting my mother's gaze directly. Just like you wanted. Let us drink to absolute honesty. Brenda's face relaxed into a victorious, predatory smile. She picked up her glass. Jessica, eager to seal the deal and clearly stressed by the butter incident, grabbed her own glass. She did not sip it gracefully. She tipped her head back and took a massive, impatient gulp, swallowing half the tainted wine in a single motion. I barely touched the liquid to my lips before setting my glass back down on the table. So about the phone, Jessica started wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. But her sentence trailed off into a sudden sloppy giggle. Whatever dosage Brenda had crushed into that rim, it was remarkably potent. Mixed with the heavy alcohol, the chemical reaction was nearly instantaneous. Within 90 seconds, Jessica's rigid posture completely melted. Her angry shoulders slumped forward. Her eyes lost all focus, glazing over with a hazy, manic sheen. Jessica, sit up straight! Brenda hissed, looking around nervously as her daughter began to sway dangerously in the leather booth. But Jessica was completely unmoored. The heavy sedative eradicated every single one of her inhibitions. She slammed her hand down on the table, knocking over her water glass, and let out a loud, braying laugh that echoed across the quiet, sophisticated dining room. Several affluent diners turned their heads, their silver forks freezing in midair. You know what is so funny about you, Harper? Jessica slurred, her voice booming over the soft, ambient jazz playing overhead. You think you are so smart with your little spreadsheets. But Marcus is the real genius. Brenda grabbed Jessica's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fabric of her blouse. Be quiet, Jessica. You have had too much to drink. Get off me, Jessica yelled, yanking her arm away and standing up unsteadily on her feet. She leaned over the table, pointing a wavering finger directly at my face, her voice echoing off the high ceilings for the entire restaurant to hear. Dad is a pathetic idiot, Jessica announced, laughing hysterically as she stumbled against the table. He actually thought Marcus was building a tech company. But Marcus is so much smarter than that. As soon as we get him out of jail, we are not stopping with the house money. Marcus already copied all of Dad's banking passwords from his home computer. We are going to drain his entire retirement account by Friday, and that old fool will not even see it coming. Jessica's chest heaved with the effort of her drunken proclamation. Then, as if an invisible string holding her upright had been violently snipped, her eyes rolled back into her head. She collapsed forward, her face planting directly into the remnants of the butter-smeared bread basket. A soft, rhythmic snore immediately began to emanate from her resting form. The silence in the Michelin-starred restaurant was absolute. The soft jazz playing overhead seemed to mock the sheer vulgarity of the scene. Dozens of affluent patrons, city council members, and corporate executives were staring directly at our corner booth. Brenda looked as though she had been physically struck by lightning. Her meticulously maintained facade of wealthy suburban respectability had just been obliterated in front of Boston's elite. She grabbed Jessica by the shoulder, shaking her frantically, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her daughter's ruined silk blouse. "Jessica, wake up!" Brenda hissed, her voice trembling with absolute panic. "Wake up right now! People are staring at us!" But Jessica was dead to the world, completely incapacitated by the heavy sedative Brenda herself had crushed into the wine glass intended for me. A severe-looking maitre d' materialized at the edge of our table. He did not ask if we were enjoying our evening. He held a black leather folio containing the bill, his posture radiating barely contained disdain. He placed the folder directly in the center of the table. Brenda looked at the leather booklet, then slowly raised her eyes to meet mine. The panic in her expression morphed into a desperate, pleading expectation. They had ordered 3 bottles of vintage champagne, a dozen oysters and white truffle risotto, fully intending to stick me with the exorbitant tab while I was unconscious. "Harper," Brenda whispered, her voice cracking as she struggled to hold Jessica upright. "Please. I left my purse in the car. You have to take care of this. You cannot just leave us here like this. We are your family." I reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out a single crisp $100 bill. I placed it neatly on top of the black leather folder. "That covers my sparkling water and the bread basket. Jessica just ruined," I said, my voice smooth, clinical, and completely devoid of empathy. "The rest of the $1,200 bill is your responsibility. Perhaps you can ask Richard to cover it." "Oh wait, Marcus already drained his accounts." "You cannot do this," Brenda gasped, real tears finally spilling over her heavily mascaraed eyelashes. "I cannot carry her out of here alone. The manager is going to call the police." I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my blazer. "I am sure you will figure something out, Brenda. You have always been so incredibly resourceful when it comes to stealing from other people." I turned my back on her, panicked, sobbing, and walked out of the dining room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. The maitre d' stepped aside to let me pass, offering a crisp, respectful nod as I exited into the cool night air. The drive back to my luxury high-rise was peaceful. The toxic weight that had pressed down on my chest for 30 years was entirely gone. I parked in my secure underground garage, took the private express elevator directly to my penthouse, and walked straight to my glass desk. I opened my encrypted laptop and logged into the building's central management mainframe. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I accessed the utility control grid for the 42nd floor. Marcus had made a fatal error by plugging his federal wire fraud equipment into the electrical outlets of my guest room. It gave me the absolute legal justification I needed to execute my next move. I selected Unit 4201. I clicked the maintenance override protocol and typed in the authorization code. "Emergency electrical hazard caused by illegal tampering. Immediate utility severance required." I hit enter. Deep within the infrastructure of the building, heavy breakers tripped and industrial valves rotated shut. I completely severed the main power grid and the central water lines to my former apartment. I switched my monitor over to my private security network. I had never told my family about the battery-powered motion-activated hidden cameras I had installed inside the smoke detectors of my apartment years ago. The live feed loaded, bathing my screen in the eerie green glow of night vision. 10 minutes later, the front door of the apartment swung open. Brenda stumbled inside, panting and groaning under the dead weight of a completely unconscious Jessica. Brenda reached for the entryway light switch, frantically flicking it up and down. Nothing happened. She dragged Jessica into the living room, dumping her unceremoniously onto the expensive Italian sofa my sister had mocked just yesterday. Brenda rushed to the kitchen, grabbing a glass from the cabinet and shoving it under the sink faucet. She yanked the handle. A pathetic hollow wheeze echoed from the pipes, but not a single drop of water materialized. Through the high-definition audio feed, I could hear Brenda's ragged, terrified breathing. The temperature outside was hovering near freezing, and without the central heating system, the ambient temperature inside the luxury corner unit was rapidly plummeting. Brenda wrapped her coat tightly around her shoulders, shivering as she pulled out her phone. The screen illuminated her panicked face in the pitch-black apartment. She was likely trying to call Richard, completely unaware that federal agents were currently swarming his suburban home. She was trapped in a dark, freezing box of her own making, with no water, no power, and an incapacitated daughter. I sat back in my plush leather chair, watching the monitor with cold, detached satisfaction. I poured myself a glass of actual, untainted red wine and let the hours tick by. It was nearly 3 in the morning when the green night vision feed suddenly shook. A violent, deafening crash echoed through the audio speakers. Brenda shrieked, jumping off the floor where she had been huddled for warmth. Another massive impact struck the front door. The heavy oak frame splintered, the deadbolt tearing cleanly out of the reinforced steel frame. The door burst open, slamming hard against the entryway wall. Marcus stood in the doorway. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with erratic, furious energy. His designer suit was torn, his tie was missing, and his eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely deranged. He had clearly used the very last stolen penny of Richard's liquidated retirement fund to post emergency federal bail. He was not running from the authorities. He had come straight to the apartment looking for blood. In his right hand, he tightly gripped a heavy, solid steel crowbar. "Where is Harper?" Marcus screamed, his voice raw and violent, echoing through the freezing, pitch-black apartment. "Where is she?" He swung the solid steel crowbar with reckless, primitive force. The heavy metal connected with the entryway console table, splintering the cheap particle board into a dozen jagged fragments. The sound of shattering wood and breaking glass echoed like gunfire through the freezing, pitch-black apartment. I sat perfectly still in my heated penthouse miles away, watching the night vision feed on my encrypted monitor as Marcus tore through my former home like a rabid animal. He kicked the remains of the table aside and stalked down the narrow hallway, his chest heaving with erratic, ragged breaths. He dragged the tip of the crowbar along the drywall, carving a deep, jagged trench into the plaster as he marched toward the main living area. He was hunting me, entirely consumed by a desperate, adrenaline-fueled rage. He rounded the corner into the living room, raising the weapon high above his head, fully prepared to strike. But he did not find me. His eyes adjusted to the ambient moonlight filtering through the frosted windows, landing on the pathetic scene, huddled in the center of the room. Brenda was pressed tightly into the corner of the Italian sofa, her expensive coat wrapped around her shivering frame, her eyes wide with absolute terror. Beside her, Jessica was just beginning to stir from her heavy, chemically induced stupor. She moaned softly, wiping a smear of dried butter from her cheek, completely oblivious to the violent threat looming over them. Marcus lowered the crowbar slightly, his face contorting with disgust. "Where is she?" he barked, his voice sharp and demanding. "Where is Harper?" Brenda scrambled backward, pulling her knees to her chest. "She is not here, Marcus. She left us at the restaurant. She cut the power and the water. We are freezing. You need to get us out of here." Marcus ignored her pleading. He stepped closer to the sofa, looming over his intoxicated wife. He reached out, grabbing Jessica roughly by the shoulder and shaking her awake. "Did you get the phone?" he demanded, his grip tightening. "Tell me you forced her to unlock the phone and wipe the footage. Tell me you did exactly what I explicitly instructed you to do. Jessica blinked heavily, her bloodshot eyes struggling to focus on her husband's furious face. The bread, she mumbled her words thick and slurred. She knocked over the bread. The wine made me dizzy. Marcus released her with a violent shove, sending her falling back against the cushions. He gripped the crowbar with both hands, his knuckles turning white. You stupid, useless women, he screamed, his voice vibrating with absolute panic. I am facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The FBI seized my servers. They froze the offshore accounts. They have the credit card logs. I needed that local footage destroyed to cast reasonable doubt on my physical presence in this unit. And you sat at a luxury restaurant drinking wine. I leaned forward in my leather chair, adjusting the audio settings on my control panel. The time for observation was over. I toggled the microphone switch, routing my voice directly through the two-way speaker concealed within the smoke detector mounted directly above Marcus's head. Looking for me, Marcus? I asked. My voice dropped into the freezing, silent apartment like a physical weight. Crisp, amplified, and entirely devoid of emotion. Marcus froze instantly. He whipped his head around, his panicked eyes scanning the dark corners of the ceiling, desperately searching for the source of the sound. Brenda clamped her hands over her ears, letting out a muffled shriek. Jessica simply stared upward, her drugged mind, unable to process the disembodied voice. Show yourself! Harper, Marcus yelled, gripping the crowbar tightly and spinning in a slow, erratic circle. Face me right now. I am currently sitting in a secure, heated penthouse, monitoring your hostile invasion of a residential property, I replied calmly. You are currently standing in the dark, wielding a deadly weapon, having just admitted to federal wire fraud on a recorded feed. But that is not your biggest problem tonight, Marcus. Your biggest problem is the bail money. Marcus stopped spinning. His chest stopped heaving. A cold, absolute dread washed over his face, visible even through the green tint of the night vision camera. I reviewed the emergency wire transfer you initiated 4 hours ago. I continued delivering the information with the clinical precision of a corporate audit. You liquidated Richard's primary retirement account. You transferred $300,000 to a federal bail bondsman to secure your temporary release. It was a desperate, panicked move. It was also incredibly stupid. Did you honestly think a senior financial auditor would not flag a massive, uncharacteristic domestic wire transfer? Shut up, Marcus hissed, taking a step toward the center of the room. I contacted the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Immediately after the wire cleared, I stated, my voice echoing off the cold drywall. I provided them with the forged secondary mortgage documents your mother-in-law signed to fund your startup. I proved that the initial seed money for your operation was obtained through major bank fraud and aggravated identity theft. Therefore, any funds associated with your extended family network are now legally classified as the proceeds of a criminal enterprise. You used stolen money to pay a federal court, Marcus. Your bail is officially revoked. Marcus let out a guttural primal scream of pure rage. He finally spotted the tiny red light of the smoke detector mounted near the ceiling vent. He lunged forward, swinging the heavy steel crowbar in a violent upward arc. The metal smashed directly into the plastic casing. My monitor instantly cut to black, replaced by a wall of static. I reached out and calmly pressed the power button on my monitor, plunging my own office into a quiet, peaceful silence. The feed was gone, but I did not need a camera to know exactly what was happening next. Inside the freezing apartment, the darkness was suddenly pierced by a rhythmic flashing light. Intense beams of red and blue swept violently through the frosted glass of the living room windows, painting Marcus, Jessica, and Brenda in stark, frantic colors. The heavy, unmistakable wail of multiple approaching sirens tore through the quiet neighborhood, growing exponentially louder by the second. Marcus dropped the crowbar. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. He rushed to the window, pulling back the cheap blinds. Below him, tactical vehicles were swarming the property line. Federal agents in heavy body armor were pouring out of armored transport vans, establishing a hard perimeter around all exits and moving rapidly toward the main stairwell. There were no escape routes. There were no blind spots. He slowly turned back to face his wife. Jessica was sitting upright now, the sheer terror of the approaching sirens finally burning through the heavy sedatives in her system. She looked at him with wide, pleading eyes, silently begging him to fix the nightmare she had helped create. Marcus stared at her, the final crushing realization hitting him with the force of a freight train. Jessica had not secured a safe house. She had not managed a discreet rendezvous or provided a sanctuary for a fugitive on the run. She had dragged him directly back to the very scene of the crime. She had delivered him into a freezing locked cage, meticulously monitored by the exact woman he had arrogantly tried to destroy. Marcus did not run immediately. The absolute failure of his escape plan twisted his panic into a violent, destructive rage. He gripped the heavy steel crowbar in both hands and began stalking through the pitch-black apartment like a cornered predator. He swung the weapon wildly, smashing the remnants of my cheap particle board furniture. He shattered the coffee table, pulverized the television stand, and tore jagged, deep gashes through the apartment drywall, screaming my name into the freezing darkness. He found nothing but Brenda and Jessica. They were huddled together in the far corner of the living room, shivering uncontrollably in the frigid, unheated air. Jessica was barely conscious, her drugged mind completely unable to process the destruction happening around her, while Brenda cowered behind her daughter, weeping in pure, unadulterated terror. I sat perfectly still in my heated penthouse, watching the green glow of the night vision feed on my encrypted monitor. I reached out and toggled the microphone switch on my control panel, routing my voice directly through the two-way audio speaker concealed within the living room smoke detector. "Looking for me, Marcus?" I asked. My voice dropped into the silent, freezing apartment, crisp, amplified, and entirely devoid of emotion. Marcus froze instantly. He whipped his head upward, his wild, bloodshot eyes locking onto the tiny, blinking red indicator light on the ceiling. He let out a guttural, furious scream, raising the heavy crowbar high above his head to strike. "Before you destroy that camera, you should check your phone." I continued, speaking with the rapid, clinical precision of a corporate audit. "I reviewed the emergency wire transfer you initiated to secure your temporary release. You liquidated Richard's retirement account to pay the bail bondsman. Unfortunately for you, I already provided the FBI and the IRS with the forged mortgage documents Brenda used to fund your initial startup. Every single dollar associated with this extended family is now legally classified as the proceeds of a criminal enterprise. You used stolen money to pay a federal court, Marcus. Your bail is officially revoked." Marcus swung the crowbar in a brutal upward arc. The heavy steel pulverized the plastic smoke detector, instantly turning my live video feed to a wall of gray static. I simply powered down the monitor. He could break the camera, but he could not stop the inevitable. Down on the street level, blinding red and blue lights were already painting the building's exterior. Federal tactical agents in heavy body armor swarmed the lobby, securing the exits and flooding the stairwells. Marcus had realized his fatal error too late. Jessica had not secured a safe house or a discreet sanctuary for a fugitive. She had dragged him directly back to the scene of the crime, trapping him in a locked concrete cage monitored by the very woman he had arrogantly tried to destroy. With the physical threat permanently neutralized, I turned my attention to my secondary financial terminal. A glaring numerical inconsistency still gnawed at the analytical center of my brain. Marcus had drained Richard's retirement portfolio to post bail, but standard financial regulations mandated a strict holding period for liquidating traditional retirement assets. You could not simply move $300,000 of mutual funds into a bail bondsman's escrow account at 2 in the morning. The transaction had cleared instantly. That meant the retirement account was heavily collateralized by a deeply hidden, highly liquid shadow account. I initiated a recursive trace program, deploying my firm's elite algorithmic software to crawl backward through Brenda and Richard's historical financial footprints. I bypassed their standard retail banking firewalls in seconds, digging deep into the archived metadata of their earliest joint tax filings. The software chewed through decades of returns, dummy corporations, and canceled credit lines until it snagged on a single heavily encrypted routing number buried beneath a defunct Delaware LLC. The account had been opened exactly 20 years ago. It had sat dormant for the last decade, functioning solely as a collateral ghost account to artificially inflate Richard's creditworthiness. I cracked the encryption protocol and pulled the digitized establishment documents onto my main screen. The title of the file read, "The Theodore Harrington Irrevocable Educational Trust." My hands froze over the keyboard. Theodore was my late maternal grandfather. He had passed away when I was 15 years old. My mother had always claimed he died absolutely penniless, leaving behind nothing but debts and a mountain of medical bills that she had heroically shouldered. She had used his supposed poverty as a cautionary tale, a weapon to lecture me about the strict necessity of settling for practical, low-paying jobs. I opened the primary ledger. My grandfather had not died penniless. He had left behind a meticulously funded trust account, explicitly designated for my university education, living expenses, and professional development. He had left me $500,000. I stared at the black and white numbers on the screen, a cold, suffocating pressure building in my chest. If this money had always existed, I needed to know exactly how Brenda had legally bypassed the irrevocable beneficiary clause to gain total control of the capital. I pulled the associated court filings, scanning the digitized legal decrees from the county probate court. The answer was waiting in a scanned document dated 3 days after my 18th birthday. Brenda and Richard had filed a joint petition for permanent conservatorship. Attached to the petition was a sworn medical affidavit signed by a private, highly expensive psychiatrist. I instantly recognized the doctor's name. It was the friendly, soft-spoken career counselor my parents had forced me to visit during my senior year of high school, claiming I needed professional guidance because my ambitions were too unrealistic. I had sat in his plush office expressing my intense desire to attend a top-tier university and build a corporate career, while he smiled sympathetically and took copious notes. The affidavit did not mention my academic ambitions. It explicitly diagnosed me as emotionally unstable, prone to severe delusions of grandeur, and completely mentally unfit to manage basic financial assets. My own parents had legally assassinated my character and stripped away my autonomy before my adult life had even begun. Armed with that fraudulent medical evaluation, a sympathetic judge had granted Brenda and Richard absolute control over my $500,000 trust. I opened the withdrawal history, tracing exactly where my future had gone. 2 months after the conservatorship was granted, Brenda initiated a massive wire transfer for $80,000. The memo line read, "Down payment assistance, Jessica's first home." They had bought my sister her sprawling 4-bedroom suburban house, the exact same house my parents always pointed to as absolute proof of Jessica's superior work ethic and maturity. 6 months later, another $100,000 evaporated, funneled directly into Richard's pathetic, doomed consulting firm. The remaining balance had been systematically bled dry over the next 5 years to fund Brenda's European cruises, luxury car leases, and country club memberships. They had literally stolen my foundation to build their own opulent illusions. I sat back in my leather chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting off my face. The realization did not break me. It did not reduce me to tears or send me into a spiral of grief. Instead, it provided absolute crystalline clarity. I thought back to my college years. I thought of the brutal, crushing weight of the 12% interest student loans I had been forced to sign. I thought of the nights I had slept in my freezing car because I could not afford both rent and textbooks. I thought of the 3 overlapping waitressing jobs, the sheer exhaustion, the constant grinding poverty that had defined my entire young adult life. My struggles had not been the unfortunate reality of a lower middle-class upbringing. My poverty had been artificially manufactured. My parents had deliberately forced me to starve while they feasted on my inheritance. I did not scream. I did not throw anything. I reached out and opened a blank legal template on my firm's secure server. If they wanted to use the law to steal my life, I would use the law to completely obliterate theirs. I began typing with ruthless mechanical precision. I bypassed the criminal statutes entirely and moved straight into civil devastation. I drafted a comprehensive, highly aggressive lawsuit naming Brenda, Richard, and Jessica as co-conspirators in a decades-long racketeering scheme. I outlined the fraud, the forged medical documents, the embezzlement of the trust, and the profound emotional and financial damages they had intentionally inflicted. I did not sue them for the stolen $500,000. Factoring in 20 years of compounding market interest, punitive damages, and gross negligence, I set the baseline settlement demand at $3 million. I would freeze every asset they possessed. I would seize Jessica's house, liquidate Richard's remaining properties, and garnish their wages until the day they died. I hit save on the civil suit draft just as my secondary monitor flared with activity. The lobby security feed showed the ground floor erupting into absolute chaos. Marcus had abandoned his hunt on the 42nd floor, realizing the sirens meant he was entirely surrounded. He sprinted out of the main stairwell into the marble lobby, his face a mask of primal panic. He still gripped the heavy steel crowbar, wielding it like a club, as he charged toward the revolving glass doors. He never made it halfway across the floor. A tactical SWAT unit breached the front entrance, shattering the glass panels in their haste to secure the perimeter. 6 heavily armed federal agents swarmed the lobby. Marcus swung the crowbar wildly, a desperate, pathetic final stand against an overwhelming force. An agent tackled him from the blind side, driving a heavily armored shoulder directly into Marcus's ribcage. The impact lifted Marcus off his feet, slamming him brutally onto the polished marble. The crowbar skittered across the floor, completely out of reach. Within seconds, Marcus was pinned face down, his hands securely zip-tied behind his back, his federal wire fraud empire effectively reduced to dust. I watched the agents drag him out to a waiting transport van. I closed the monitor feed, stood up and straightened my blazer. It was time to clear out the remaining trash. I walked into my private study, grabbed a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents, and stepped out into my penthouse corridor. My lead corporate attorney, Vance, was already waiting for me by the private elevator, flanked by 2 towering members of my building's elite private security detail. Vance held a pristine leather folio containing the necessary paperwork. I did not need to give any instructions. We stepped into the elevator in complete silence and descended to the 42nd floor. The hallway was freezing, the ambient temperature having plummeted since I severed the utility grid. We approached Unit 4201. The heavy oak door hung haphazardly off its hinges, a casualty of Marcus's earlier rampage. I stepped over the splintered wood and walked directly into the dark, frigid apartment. Brenda and Jessica were still huddled on the living room floor, clutching their designer coats tightly around their shivering bodies. They looked up, their eyes wide and bloodshot in the dim moonlight filtering through the windows. When they saw me standing there, flanked by my attorney and 2 massive security guards, the sheer relief on Brenda's face was instantaneous. "Harper," my mother cried out, scrambling unsteadily to her feet. "You brought help. Thank God you came." Marcus went completely insane. "The police just dragged him away. You have to tell your security men to fix the door and turn the heat back on before we freeze to death." I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not step forward to embrace her. I simply extended my hand toward Vance. He placed a single laminated sheet of paper into my palm. I tossed it onto the shattered remains of the coffee table. "That is a formal emergency eviction notice," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the bare walls. "You have exactly 30 minutes to gather whatever personal belongings you can physically carry and vacate the premises. After 30 minutes, my security team will escort you out of the building by force, and the local police will arrest you for criminal trespassing." Jessica pushed herself up from the floor, her face twisting into an ugly, indignant sneer. Her silk blouse was still smeared with the butter from the restaurant, making her look entirely pathetic. "You cannot evict us," Jessica snapped, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You are just another tenant in this building. I have a signed, legally binding residential lease for this specific unit. You have zero authority to kick us out." Vance stepped forward, opening his leather folio. He pulled out a certified corporate ownership deed and held it up for them to see. "My client is not a tenant," he clarified, his tone remarkably bored. "My client is the sole managing director of Pinnacle Holdings, LLC. That is the corporate entity that owns this entire luxury high-rise. You forged a residential lease to squat in a building owned exclusively by your sister. Furthermore, your husband utilized this property to operate a federal wire fraud syndicate, actively destroying the electrical grid in the process. You are being evicted for catastrophic property damage and engaging in an illegal criminal enterprise on the premises." The color drained instantly from Jessica's face. The arrogant sneer collapsed, replaced by a hollow, gaping realization. She had thought she was outsmarting me by forging a fake lease in a prestigious building. She had no idea she had voluntarily locked herself inside a fortress that I completely controlled. "You own the building," Brenda whispered, her eyes darting frantically between me and the security guards. "Harper, you cannot do this. We are your family." "You lost the right to use that word 20 years ago," I replied, taking a step closer to my mother. "You lost that right the day you and Richard dragged me to a corrupt psychiatrist, forged a medical affidavit claiming I was mentally unstable, and stole my $500,000 college trust fund." Brenda gasped, physically stumbling backward as if she had been struck. She covered her mouth with her hands, entirely unable to form a coherent lie. Jessica, however, snapped entirely. The realization that she was completely broke, that her husband was facing 20 years in federal prison, and that I held absolute unyielding power over her existence, triggered a violent feral rage. "You ruined my life," Jessica screamed, launching herself directly at me. Her hands curled into claws, aiming straight for my face. She never even came close. The security guard on my right moved with blinding speed. He stepped smoothly in front of me, intercepting Jessica mid-lunge. He grabbed her by the shoulders, spun her around, and pinned her firmly against the drywall. Jessica thrashed wildly, kicking her feet and screaming obscenities, but the guard held her completely immobilized with effortless professional ease. "Let me go!" Jessica shrieked, tears of sheer fury streaming down her face. "You planned this! You set us up!" "You set yourself up, Jessica," I said, watching her struggle against the guard. "I just let you walk into your own trap." Brenda fell to her knees, her hands clasped together in front of her chest. She reverted instantly to her ultimate weapon, playing the desperate, helpless victim. "Harper, please," Brenda wailed, genuine panic finally breaking through her theatrical performance. "You cannot throw us out onto the street tonight. Richard's accounts are frozen. Marcus took our last dollar. We have absolutely nowhere to go. You are making your own mother homeless. Have some pity." I looked down at the woman who had deliberately manufactured my entire life of poverty, who had forced me to take out crushing student loans, while she bought luxury cars with my inheritance. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a worn, faded piece of paper. I had kept it in my wallet for almost 2 decades. I dropped the paper onto the floor right in front of Brenda's knees. "That is the address to the downtown women's homeless shelter," I said, staring into her terrified eyes. "It is the exact same piece of paper you handed me on my 18th birthday, right before you changed the locks on the front door and told me to figure it out." The image of Brenda clutching that shelter address was the perfect capstone to that night. 3 weeks passed, with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate liquidation. The federal criminal trial for Marcus was advancing with terrifying speed, while my $3 million civil lawsuit against Brenda, Richard, and Jessica had completely paralyzed their existence. Every bank account they held was frozen. Every asset was placed under heavy judicial scrutiny. They were suffocating under the weight of their own consequences. I was sitting at my polished mahogany desk on the top floor of Pinnacle Holdings, finalizing the evidentiary exhibits for my upcoming deposition. The panoramic view of the Boston skyline stretched out behind me, bathed in crisp afternoon sunlight. The environment was entirely tranquil, a stark contrast to the chaos I had unleashed upon my blood relatives. The heavy glass doors to my executive suite suddenly burst open. My receptionist, a highly trained professional, was physically pushed aside as Richard barged into the room. He looked absolutely unrecognizable. The custom-tailored Italian suits and the arrogant patriarchal posture were completely gone. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt, his face was unshaven, and his hands were trembling violently. 2 of my corporate security guards were instantly on his heels, reaching out to drag him backward by his collar. I raised a single hand, signaling the guards to stop. They released his arms but stood exactly 1 foot behind him, ready to strike at the slightest provocation. Richard did not shout. He did not puff out his chest or demand respect. Instead, he took 2 unsteady steps forward and collapsed directly onto his knees. Right there on my imported wool rug, my father began to weep. It was a pathetic, loud, heaving display of manufactured sorrow. Harper, please, he sobbed, clasping his hands together like a penitent beggar. You have to stop this. You have to drop the civil suit. The retainer fees for the defense attorneys are bankrupting me. The federal prosecutors are threatening to seize my remaining business assets as part of Marcus's restitution. We have nothing left. Jessica and Brenda are living in a cheap, filthy motel. I am drowning in debt. Please, Harper. I am your father. Have some mercy. I did not look up from my laptop. I kept my fingers moving across the keyboard, completing a spreadsheet formula with absolute precision. The rhythmic clicking of the keys was the only response I offered to his theatrical breakdown. Mercy is a fascinating concept, Richard said, my eyes remaining locked on my monitor. Let us discuss mercy. I hit the enter key and finally turned my gaze down to the broken man kneeling on my floor. I remember calling you from a payphone when I was 19 years old. I stated, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. I had not eaten a proper meal in 4 days. I begged you for a $50 loan just to keep my heating turned on during a massive winter blizzard. You told me that hardship builds character and hung up the phone. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a finger, silencing him instantly. I remember when I needed a co-signer for my very first apartment, because my credit was non-existent. I continued, leaning slightly over the desk. You explicitly told the leasing agent that I was financially irresponsible and a massive liability. You ensured my application was denied. I slept in the back of a freezing Honda Civic for 3 consecutive months. During those exact same 3 months, you and Brenda took Jessica on a first-class wine tasting tour through Tuscany. You paid for that trip using the exact educational trust fund you actively stole from me. You ignored every single plea for help I ever made. You did not just watch me struggle. You actively manufactured my suffering to fund your own illusions of grandeur. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder. I tossed it over the edge of the desk. It landed with a heavy slap on the floor, sliding directly against Richard's knees. You are not just bankrupt, Richard, I stated clinically. You are officially homeless. That is a formal notice of foreclosure from your primary mortgage lender. Since I initiated the asset freeze, your automatic payments bounced. The bank is seizing your suburban estate. You have 14 days to vacate the premises before the county sheriff physically removes you and changes the locks. Richard stared down at the document. The loud, theatrical sobbing stopped instantly. The pathetic weeping father routine vanished entirely, replaced by the cornered, venomous arrogance I had known my entire life. He slowly stood up, brushing the lint off his wrinkled trousers. His eyes narrowed into dark, hateful slits. You think you are untouchable, you ungrateful little witch, he spat, stepping aggressively toward my desk. The security guards immediately tensed, reaching for him, but I waved them off again. I wanted him to finish. You think you can just orchestrate our ruin and walk away clean? Richard snarled, his face turning a dark shade of crimson. If you do not drop this civil suit right now, I will walk straight into the United States Attorney's office. I will testify under oath that you were the mastermind behind Marcus's entire wire fraud syndicate. I will tell the federal agents that you used your massive corporate infrastructure to hide his stolen assets and that you intentionally set him up to take the fall. It will be my word against yours, and I will drag you down into a federal prison cell with us. I will destroy your entire life. I smiled. It was a slow, genuinely amused smile. I reached out and tapped the spacebar on my laptop. The sophisticated surround sound speakers integrated into my office ceiling crackled to life. Richard's own voice echoed crystal clear through the executive suite. It was a recording from exactly 4 years ago, captured during a highly confidential meeting he thought he was having with a private offshore wealth manager. Yes, Marcus handles the digital side of the fraud, but I am the one washing the capital through the shell companies. Richard's recorded voice boasted loudly over the speakers. The fake real estate holdings in the Caymans are entirely my design. Marcus is an idiot. He just steals the data. I am the one laundering the millions without leaving a single fingerprint. We run the stolen money through Brenda's charity accounts first, then scatter it offshore. I am untouchable. I pressed the spacebar again, cutting the audio. The silence in the office was absolute. Did you really think a boutique offshore wealth management firm would not vet their prospective clients thoroughly? Richard asked, leaning back in my chair. especially when that firm is a direct, wholly owned subsidiary of Pinnacle Holdings. Richard's face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He realized in that agonizing second that I had not just been watching their recent mistakes. I had been systematically dismantling their entire criminal empire for years, gathering every piece of necessary ammunition before I ever fired the first shot. 3 weeks later, the sterile, oppressive air of the federal courthouse stood in stark contrast to the quiet luxury of my penthouse. The criminal trial against Marcus had moved with unprecedented speed, fueled by the mountain of irrefutable digital evidence I had handed directly to the federal prosecutors. Marcus sat at the defense table, his arrogant posture completely broken. He wore a cheap, off-the-rack suit, a direct consequence of my civil lawsuits, freezing every single dollar of his stolen assets. But Marcus had managed to secure one last asset. A slick, highly aggressive defense attorney named Sterling, a man notorious for turning black and white fraud cases into murky, emotional theater. Sterling paced back and forth in front of the jury box. He did not ask me about the server logs. He did not ask about the offshore wire transfers or the forged corporate documents. He knew he could not win on the facts. He was going for a complete character assassination. Isn't it true, Miss Harrington, that you have harbored a deep, simmering resentment toward your sister for your entire adult life? Sterling asked, his voice dripping with theatrical sympathy for his client. I sat perfectly still on the witness stand, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I harbor no resentment, I replied, my voice projecting crisp and cold across the silent courtroom. I simply hold people accountable for their actions. Accountable? Sterling laughed, turning to face the jury with a look of absolute disbelief. You call your actions accountability? You threw your own mother and sister out onto the freezing street in the middle of the night. You intentionally severed their utility grid. You launched a frivolous $3 million civil suit to bankrupt your father. Those are not the actions of a concerned citizen, Miss Harrington. Those are the actions of a vindictive, jealous spinster. Objection, the federal prosecutor barked, standing up from his table. Badgering the witness. Overruled, the judge stated flatly, peering down from the bench. I will allow a degree of latitude, but watch your tone, counselor. Sterling turned his predatory gaze back to me. You are a wealthy, isolated woman, living alone in a glass tower. He continued, his voice rising in volume. You watched your younger sister build a vibrant, loving family. You watched her marry a brilliant, successful African-American entrepreneur who was building his own legacy. And you could not stand it, could you? You could not tolerate her happiness. I remained entirely devoid of emotion. I stared directly into Sterling's eyes. My marital status and my sister's personal life are completely irrelevant to the fact that your client operated an illegal wire fraud syndicate out of my residential building, I stated calmly. Irrelevant? Sterling echoed, slamming his hand down on the wooden podium. It is the entire motive. You despise my client. You possess a rigid, elitist worldview, and you possess deep-seated inherent racial prejudices. You saw an African-American man succeeding where you felt he did not belong, marrying into your family, and you decided to destroy him out of pure, unadulterated spite. You fabricated this entire narrative. You framed your brother-in-law because you are a bitter, lonely woman who wanted to tear down the perfect family you could never have. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of shocked whispers. In the gallery, Brenda leaned forward, a triumphant, sickening smile spreading across her face. Jessica was actually dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the devoted, victimized wife to absolute perfection. The jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could see the doubt taking root in their eyes. Sterling was spinning a masterful, highly emotional narrative, painting Marcus as the tragic victim of a wealthy, racist, scorned woman's vendetta. Did you or did you not explicitly instruct your security team to forcibly remove my client's wife from your property? Sterling demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at me. I evicted a tenant who forged a lease agreement to facilitate a criminal enterprise. I replied, my voice remaining an unbreakable block of ice. Sterling shook his head in mock disgust. You are cold, Miss Harrington. Ice cold. You framed an innocent family man because of your own miserable isolation. I have no further questions for this witness. Sterling marched back to the defense table and sat down next to Marcus. Marcus looked up at me, a smug, arrogant smirk finally returning to his face. He thought he had won. He thought the jury had bought the tragic family man routine. The judge looked over at the prosecution table. Does the state have any redirect? The federal prosecutor stood up. He glanced down at a small folded note that my corporate attorney Vance had discreetly handed him just moments before the cross-examination ended. The prosecutor read the note, a subtle, sharp smile touching the corner of his mouth. Your Honor. The defense has spent the last 20 minutes aggressively opening the door to the defendant's character, his unwavering marital devotion, and his supposed perfect family life, the prosecutor stated smoothly. In light of this narrative, the state calls a surprise rebuttal witness. Sterling jumped to his feet. Objection. This is highly irregular. We were not provided with a rebuttal witness list. The defense opened the door to character testimony. The judge fired back instantly. The state has the right to rebut your specific claims regarding the defendant's family life. The objection is overruled. Call your witness. The heavy mahogany doors at the very back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, echoing thud. The rhythmic clicking of sensible heels tapped against the polished hardwood floor. Every single head in the courtroom turned. A young, striking woman stepped through the doorway. She possessed sharp features and an exhausted but determined expression. She was not alone. Resting comfortably on her hip, clutching a small stuffed animal, was a toddler. The little boy had bright, observant eyes and a familiar curl to his dark hair. I shifted my gaze from the back of the courtroom directly to the defense table. Marcus was staring at the heavy wooden doors. The smug, arrogant smirk was entirely gone. Every single ounce of blood drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went completely slack and his hands began to tremble so violently that his pen clattered loudly onto the wooden desk. In the gallery! Jessica stood up, her brow furrowed in deep confusion as she stared at the strange woman walking down the center aisle. She did not understand what was happening, but Marcus understood perfectly. His perfect, devoted family man facade had just walked into the federal courtroom, holding his biggest, most catastrophic secret in her arms. The woman walked with a weary but unmistakable dignity. She bypassed the gallery entirely, moving with deliberate steps toward the front of the courtroom as the bailiff guided her forward. I remained seated on the witness stand, my expression an unreadable mask of frost, watching the precise moment my brother-in-law's entire existence evaporated. Your Honor, the state calls Sarah Jenkins, the federal prosecutor announced, gesturing for the woman to take the secondary witness chair. The judge nodded, his eyes darting between Marcus's suddenly pale face and the toddler cooing softly in the woman's arms. Proceed, counselor. Miss Jenkins, please state your relationship to the defendant. The prosecutor instructed, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. Sarah adjusted the child on her knee, her gaze locking directly onto Marcus with a mixture of exhaustion and profound disgust. I am his legal wedded wife. We have been married for 6 years. This is our son David. The courtroom did not just erupt, it exploded. That is a lie! Jessica shrieked, bolting upright in the gallery. Her designer pearls rattled violently against her collarbone as she pointed a manicured, trembling finger at the witness stand. He is my husband. We are married. You are a pathetic liar. Order, the judge roared, slamming his wooden gavel down with enough force to echo like a gunshot across the high ceilings. Bailiff, control the gallery or clear it entirely. Brenda frantically grabbed Jessica by the arm, dragging her golden child back down onto the hard wooden bench. Jessica was hyperventilating, her eyes wide and frantic, darting wildly between Marcus and the strange woman holding his identical son. The arrogant, scorned sister narrative that Sterling had so carefully constructed was instantly obliterated. It was swept away by a tidal wave of sheer, undeniable reality. Miss Jenkins, the prosecutor continued smoothly, raising his voice over the residual murmurs of the stunned jury box. Could you please explain to the court how you were located and brought here today? I was contacted by Miss Harrington's corporate legal team, Sarah replied, her voice steady and remarkably clear. I had been receiving automated monthly payments from a limited liability company based in Rhode Island. Marcus told me it was an executive consulting stipend. Miss Harrington's forensic accountants proved otherwise. I allowed a microscopic razor-thin smile to touch my lips. During my comprehensive audit of the Pinnacle Holdings accounts, my financial team had flagged a highly sophisticated series of encrypted offshore wire transfers. Marcus thought he was a genius at hiding stolen capital. He was not. I traced the laundered money through 3 different shell companies directly into a suburban Rhode Island bank account. He was using the funds he actively stole from my identity to quietly pay the mortgage, child support, and living expenses for his legally recognized family across state lines. He was funding 2 entirely separate lives using my stolen credit. The federal prosecutor turned his attention to the bench, holding up a thick, certified stack of legal documents. Your Honor, the state enters into evidence the certified marriage certificate of Marcus and Sarah Jenkins, dated 6 years ago in the state of Rhode Island. Furthermore, we enter the birth certificate of their son. The defense's entire cross-examination was built upon the fragile foundation of the defendant being a devoted family man to his current partner, Jessica. We have just definitively proven that his marriage to Jessica is an illegal, fraudulent act of bigamy. The legal implications crashed over the courtroom like a physical shockwave. As this second marriage is legally null and void, the prosecutor stated, his eyes locking onto Jessica in the gallery. The state formally motions that any claim of spousal privilege regarding Jessica is entirely invalid. She is not a recognized spouse. She is an unshielded accomplice. Every email, every text message, and every financial transaction they shared is now fully admissible without restriction. Jessica physically collapsed against Brenda. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She was not the beloved, cherished wife. She was not the ultimate prize. She was nothing but a convenient, disposable mark in a long-term con. Her perfect, meticulously manicured life was not just over. It was a public, humiliating sham. The jury members stared at her with open, undeniable disgust, completely rejecting the victimized facade she had played for so long. At the defense table, Marcus was hyperventilating. His expensive, slick attorney Sterling was furiously whispering in his ear, his face flushed with genuine panic. The defense strategy was dead. There was zero chance of recovery. The federal agents had his wire transfers, his fake marriage, his money laundering network, and his actual wife testifying against his character in open court. Marcus looked up at the judge, then over at the 12 jurors. He saw 20 to 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary staring back at him. He saw the absolute end of his freedom. The sheer suffocating terror of his impending reality shattered whatever remaining loyalty he had left. "I want a deal," Marcus blurted out, his voice cracking loudly in the suddenly silent courtroom. He shoved his chair back, standing up so abruptly that it crashed hard against the wooden railing. "I want a plea deal right now." "Mr. Jenkins, sit down and consult your counsel," the judge warned severely. "No!" Marcus shouted, his primal panic overriding any sense of legal decorum. He scrambled away from his attorney, turning his desperate, terrified eyes toward the federal prosecutor. "I can give you the architects. I can give you the people who actually set up the fraud. I will testify to everything if you guarantee a reduced sentence." Sterling grabbed Marcus's arm, trying to physically pull him back down into his seat. "Your Honor, my client is under extreme emotional duress. I request an immediate recess." "I am not under duress," Marcus yelled violently, shaking off his lawyer's grip. He turned his body completely, raising a shaking hand and pointing his finger directly into the gallery. He did not point at me. He pointed straight at the 2 women cowering in the second row. Marcus points directly at Brenda and Jessica, testifying that it was Brenda who provided Harper's SSN and Jessica who orchestrated the identity theft to fund her lavish lifestyle. The second Marcus's finger locked onto the second row of the gallery. The sterile silence of the federal courtroom shattered into a million jagged pieces. It was not just an objection or a gasp. It was a complete feral eruption of panic. Brenda was the first to break. The carefully cultivated mask of the helpless, victimized matriarch disintegrated instantly. She leaped to her feet, her face contorting into an ugly crimson mask of sheer terror. "He is lying!" Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking as she wildly waved her hands in the air. "He is a desperate, filthy liar. Do not listen to him. He is just trying to save his own skin." She pointed right back at Marcus, completely throwing the man she had championed as the perfect son-in-law directly under the proverbial bus. But Jessica did not settle for screaming. The revelation that her husband had a secret family, combined with the sudden terrifying reality that he was actively trading her freedom for a plea deal, triggered a violent animalistic rage. Jessica vaulted over the low wooden partitions separating the gallery from the defense tables. She lunged at Marcus with her hands curled into vicious claws, aiming directly for his face. "You traitor!" Jessica screamed, her designer heels slipping on the polished floor as she threw her entire body weight at him. Marcus barely had time to raise his arms to protect his face before Jessica collided with him. The heavy wooden defense chair tipped backward, sending both of them crashing onto the floor in a tangled heap of expensive fabric and pure malice. Jessica thrashed wildly, slapping and scratching at Marcus, while Sterling, the high-priced defense attorney, scrambled backward in sheer terror to avoid being caught in the crossfire. While his wife screamed and his golden child violently assaulted her fraudulent husband on the courtroom floor, Richard made his move. He did not rush forward to defend his family. He did not attempt to de-escalate the situation. True to his cowardly, self-serving nature, the patriarch of the family decided to abandon them all. I watched from the corner of my eye as Richard slowly backed away from the chaotic scene. He kept his head down, using the commotion as a shield, and began to slink toward the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom. He was abandoning his wife and daughter to federal agents so he could run and save himself. He made it exactly 4 steps. 2 massive federal bailiffs, who had been stationed by the exit, instantly recognized his attempt to flee. They moved with terrifying coordinated speed. Before Richard could even reach the brass handle of the door, a bailiff grabbed him by the shoulder, spinning him around with enough force to snap his head back. "Sit down, sir, or you will be placed in restraints," the bailiff ordered, his hand resting menacingly on his utility belt. Richard's arrogant posture crumbled. He raised his hands in surrender, his face pale and sweating profusely, and backed slowly into the nearest wooden bench, trapped like a rat in a cage. Amidst this unprecedented explosion of familial cannibalism, I was utterly still. The judge had waved me off the witness stand the second Jessica cleared the partition. I walked smoothly back to the plaintiff's table, taking my seat next to my corporate attorney, Vance. I reached forward, picked up a glass of ice water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold water was incredibly refreshing. I sat quietly watching the people who had tortured me for 33 years tear each other to absolute shreds. For over 3 decades, they had operated as a unified front of manipulation and cruelty. They had coordinated my misery. They had stolen my trust fund, gaslit my reality, and treated me like a disposable stepping stone for their own ambitions. They had always relied on their twisted loyalty to protect one another. But the second the threat of federal prison became a reality, that loyalty evaporated into thin air. Marcus was trading them for a lighter sentence. Brenda was screaming that Marcus was a monster. Jessica was physically attacking her own husband. Richard was trying to literally sneak out the back door and leave them all to burn. They possessed 0 honor, 0 morality, and 0 love for anyone but themselves. It was the most beautiful, validating spectacle I had ever witnessed in my entire life. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to scream or fight or argue. I had simply presented the unvarnished truth, and the truth was currently destroying them from the inside out. "Order!" I said. "Order in my courtroom," the judge roared. The judge was standing behind the bench, his face purple with absolute unfiltered rage. He brought his heavy wooden gavel down against the sounding block with a series of violently loud cracks. "Bailiffs, separate them immediately," the judge commanded. 4 armed federal officers swarmed the defense area. They grabbed Jessica by her arms, forcefully dragging her off a cowering Marcus. Jessica kicked and thrashed, her perfectly styled hair completely ruined, her designer silk blouse torn at the shoulder. Marcus scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, straightening his cheap tie while glaring hatefully at his furious wife. The judge pointed his gavel directly at the gallery, specifically targeting Brenda and Richard, before shifting his furious gaze to Marcus and Jessica. "I have presided over federal cases for 22 years, the judge stated, his voice echoing with brutal disgust. "I have prosecuted cartel leaders, mob bosses, and violent criminals. But I have rarely witnessed such a profound, sickening display of moral bankruptcy. You have turned a United States federal courtroom into a circus. You are a family of vipers completely willing to sell each other out the second your fraudulent, pathetic empire is threatened. The courtroom fell into a deathly, terrified silence. Even Brenda stopped weeping, paralyzed by the sheer, unyielding authority radiating from the bench. Based on the sworn testimony provided today and the newly presented evidence of widespread identity theft and wire fraud, the judge continued, his eyes locking onto the women. I am expanding the scope of this investigation immediately. The state has presented compelling evidence that Brenda and Jessica willingly participated in a criminal syndicate to defraud the plaintiff. Given the defendant's testimony implicating them both, and considering the patriarch of this family just attempted to flee my courtroom, I am officially declaring Brenda and Jessica severe flight risks. Jessica stopped breathing. Brenda let out a small, strangled gasp. Bailiffs, the judge ordered, his voice echoing with absolute finality. Remand Brenda and Jessica into federal custody immediately. Strip them of all personal effects and hold them without bail. The officers moved in without hesitation. Right there in the middle of the crowded courtroom, the final layers of their arrogant facade were violently ripped away. Take off the jewelry, a female bailiff commanded coldly. Jessica sobbed hysterically as she was forced to unhook her diamond necklace and slide off her platinum rings. Brenda's hands shook violently as she surrendered her expensive watch and designer leather belt. They dropped their luxury items into a clear plastic evidence bag, the heavy diamonds clattering loudly against the plastic. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the room as cold steel was locked around their wrists, binding the golden child and the enabler mother together in absolute, inescapable ruin. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the room as cold steel was locked around their wrists, binding the golden child and the enabler mother together in absolute, inescapable ruin. Richard watched them being dragged away from his isolated corner of the gallery. He did not step forward to offer a final word of comfort. He did not look at his wife of nearly 40 years as she wept in terror. The second the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind the bailiffs, Richard bolted. He practically sprinted out of the federal courthouse, dodging reporters and ignoring the shouts of his own defense attorneys. Survival was his only instinct. He needed cash and he needed to disappear. His corporate accounts were frozen, his personal checking was drained, and his criminal associates were currently turning state's evidence to save themselves. The only tangible asset he had left was the sprawling suburban estate in Oak Ridge. It was a massive multi-million-dollar property, a monument to decades of white-collar fraud and carefully cultivated social climbing. If he could find a desperate cash buyer, he could liquidate the property at a steep discount, wire the funds to a non-extradition country, and vanish before the federal prosecutors officially indicted him. He drove his luxury sedan recklessly through the city, ignoring speed limits as he raced back to the suburbs. He dialed a shady real estate broker he knew from his country club days, a man who specialized in quiet, off-the-market transactions. He shouted instructions into his Bluetooth speaker, demanding an immediate cash offer by midnight. He did not care if he took a 50% loss. He just needed enough to run. Richard pulled into his long, circular driveway, his tires screeching against the pristine paving stones. He threw the car into park and jogged up the marble steps to the grand double front doors. He reached into his pocket, his hands shaking violently as he retrieved his keys. He shoved the gold-plated key into the lock and twisted. It did not budge. He frowned, yanking the key out and shoving it back in with more force. The internal mechanism of the lock ground against the metal. It was entirely useless. He stepped back, his chest heaving with exertion, and finally looked up at the center of the heavy oak door. A bright neon orange piece of paper was taped directly over the peephole. It was a formal notice of seizure and judicial lien. My civil attorneys had not been resting while the criminal trial played out. The moment the judge had found Marcus legally liable and the evidence of fraud indisputable, Vance had executed my civil judgment. We had placed a massive, impenetrable lion on the Oak Ridge estate. Richard could not sell it. He could not leverage it. He was legally locked out of his own home. The state had already sent a locksmith to secure the perimeter. He stood on the porch staring at the bright orange paper, the reality of his absolute destitution finally crushing him. He had no money, no family, no home, and nowhere to run. At exactly 3:14 in the morning, my private cell phone lit up on my nightstand. The screen displayed Richard's number. I did not answer. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, then rolled over and went back to sleep. 4 hours later, I stood in the massive kitchen of my penthouse. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the Boston harbor, casting a brilliant golden light across the polished marble countertops. I loaded a fresh pod into my espresso machine, listening to the quiet mechanical hum as it brewed a perfect dark shot. I picked up my phone, tapped the voicemail icon, and hit play. Richard's voice filled the quiet kitchen. He was heavily intoxicated, his words slurring together in a pathetic wet mess. "Harper, please!" He sobbed, the background noise indicating he was standing on a windy street corner somewhere. "You cannot do this to me. I am your father. I raised you. I gave you everything. You took my house. You took my wife. You took my company. I am sleeping on a concrete bench, Harper. I am freezing. Please just wire me $10,000. Just enough to get a hotel and a lawyer. Have some human decency." The tone shifted abruptly. A heavy, drunken breath rattled against the microphone, followed by a vicious, guttural snarl. "You miserable, ungrateful witch!" he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer malice. "You planned this. You destroyed us because you are a bitter, lonely failure. You will burn for this. I will make sure you burn. Call me back right now and fix this, or I swear to God I will tear your entire life apart." The recording ended with the sound of a phone violently smashing against something hard. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. The rich, bitter flavor was absolutely perfect. I felt no pity. I felt no residual anger. I felt nothing but the calm, satisfying weight of absolute justice. I tapped the screen and permanently deleted the voicemail. I set my empty espresso cup in the sink, grabbed my tailored trench coat, and headed for the private elevator. It was time to finish the job. My driver navigated the sleek black town car through the morning traffic, heading out of the city and toward the wealthy enclave of Oak Ridge. The drive was peaceful. I reviewed my latest corporate earnings reports on my tablet, completely unbothered by the destruction I had left in my wake. We pulled onto the familiar tree-lined street of my childhood. The massive suburban estate loomed at the end of the cul-de-sac, but the pristine, quiet atmosphere of the neighborhood was entirely shattered. 3 massive industrial moving trucks were parked haphazardly across the manicured lawn. A dozen men in heavy work boots were hauling antique furniture, priceless artwork, and expensive electronics out of the front doors, tossing them unceremoniously into the back of the waiting trucks. I watched as 2 men carried out Brenda's prized grand piano, bumping it against the doorframe without a shred of care. Richard was standing on the sidewalk at the edge of the property line. He looked completely broken. He was shivering in the morning air, wearing the exact same wrinkled suit from the courtroom yesterday, watching his entire life being dismantled piece by piece. He turned his head as my town car pulled up to the curb. He stepped forward, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic flare of hope. He thought I had come to save him. He thought the midnight voicemail had actually worked. I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. I did not offer him a smile. I did not offer him comfort. "What are they doing?" Richard demanded, his voice weak and trembling as he pointed at the moving crew. "Harper, you have to tell them to stop. The bank cannot seize the personal assets inside the house. Tell them to stop." "They are not from the bank, Richard," I stated coldly, walking past him toward the front gates. "They work for me. The foreclosure auction was held online at 6 o'clock this morning. Due to the catastrophic legal liens on the property, there were no other bidders. I bought this entire estate for pennies on the dollar. You have exactly 5 minutes to step off my property before I have you arrested for trespassing." Richard stood frozen on the sidewalk, his mouth opening and closing, without a single sound emerging. He had spent his entire adult life valuing appearances, status, and material wealth over actual human substance, and now he had absolutely nothing to show for it. I did not wait for his inevitable breakdown. I turned my back on the man who had actively contributed to my misery, signaled my driver, and slipped back into the quiet luxury of the town car, leaving him to watch my crew pack away the remnants of his fraudulent empire. 2 months later, the air inside the federal courthouse was thick with a heavy, suffocating finality. The criminal trial had officially concluded, the media circus had died down, and the grim reality of sentencing day hung over the room like a dark cloud. Marcus and Brenda were brought in through the side-holding doors, their wrists and ankles bound in heavy steel chains that clanked loudly against the polished floor. The sight of Brenda, a woman who once demanded the finest silks and imported cashmeres, shuffling forward in a shapeless faded orange prison jumpsuit, was a stark, undeniable testament to her monumental fall from grace. Her hair was completely gray, devoid of its expensive dye, and her face was lined with sheer exhaustion. Jessica sat at the defense table next to a visibly exhausted public defender. Without access to her stolen funds, her designer wardrobe and exclusive beauty treatments had been seized or completely discontinued. She wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray blazer, her face gaunt, her fingernails bitten down to the quick. The golden child was entirely stripped of her gold, reduced to a hollow shell of her former arrogance. The presiding judge, a man with zero tolerance for white-collar syndicate crimes, did not waste time with pleasantries. He looked down from the bench with absolute unfiltered disgust. "Marcus Jenkins," the judge began, his voice echoing sharply across the silent room. "You orchestrated a highly sophisticated network of wire fraud and identity theft, leveraging the trust of your victim for pure financial gain. You then attempted to manipulate this court with a sham marriage and fabricated character testimony. You are a predator in a tailored suit. You are sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole." Marcus physically crumbled. He slumped forward, burying his face in his shackled hands, as the catastrophic weight of a decade and a half behind bars crushed the last ounce of his pride. "Brenda Harrington," the judge continued, turning his hard, unforgiving gaze to my mother, "you actively weaponized your own daughter's personal identification, facilitating this massive theft to maintain a lifestyle you did not earn. A mother's fundamental role is to protect her child, not to plunder her resources for personal gain. Your actions are morally reprehensible. You are sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary for accessory to wire fraud and identity fraud." Brenda let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail. She swayed on her feet, her knees buckling entirely, forcing a federal bailiff to grab her by the arm and haul her back up into a standing position. "Jessica Harrington," the judge said, his tone dripping with utter contempt, "your cooperation following your husband's confession is the only reason you are not joining your mother in a prison cell today. However, your sheer greed, your entitlement, and your willing complicity will not go unpunished. I am sentencing you to 3 years of strict federal probation and 2,000 hours of community service. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay massive comprehensive financial restitution to the victim. Every dollar you earn for the foreseeable future will be garnished to repair the damage you caused." Jessica stared blankly ahead. The realization hit her with brutal force. She would be working minimum wage jobs for the rest of her natural life, and every paycheck would be handed directly over to the sister she had relentlessly bullied. She was financially ruined. "Does the victim wish to address the court?" the judge asked, his tone softening slightly as he looked toward the plaintiff's table. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored charcoal suit. I walked to the podium at the center of the room. I did not bring notes. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or scream. I looked directly at the 3 people who had spent 33 years trying to erase my worth. Accountability is a concept this family actively avoided for decades. I stated, my voice projecting with brutal surgical precision. They operated under the delusion that shared DNA was a blanket pardon for psychological abuse and financial theft. They believed that because I was quiet, I was weak. They mistook my patience for submission. I looked directly at Brenda, who was sobbing into her chained hands. "Today is not a tragedy, it is a correction. For 33 years I was told I was the failure of this family. I was the outcast. I was the profound disappointment. Yet when their fraudulent hollow empire required funding, they did not hesitate to steal my identity and drain the very success they relentlessly mocked. I am not here to offer forgiveness, nor am I here to express anger. Anger requires emotional investment, and my familial obligations are entirely dead. They died the moment my mother handed over my social security number to a criminal. They died the moment my sister funded her luxury life with my stolen credit. You are no longer my family. You are simply criminals facing the consequences of your own arrogant greed. I shifted my gaze to Jessica, who was trembling violently in her seat. I built my life with my own two hands. I protected it with the same. I have nothing left to say to these people. I yield the floor, Your Honor. I stepped away from the podium, the silence in the courtroom so profound you could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning vents. I did not look at them again. I turned and began walking down the center aisle toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room. I was finally completely free. But Jessica's fragile, shattered mind could not handle the absolute finality of my dismissal. She had lost her husband, her wealth, her mother, and her pristine reputation. The realization that I was walking away completely victorious, leaving her in a hell of her own making, snapped the last frayed wire in her brain. You ruined everything! Jessica shrieked, a raw, guttural sound of pure madness. She shoved her public defender backward, her hand darting out to snatch the heavy metal pen resting on the defense table. She lunged over the wooden partition, scrambling into the aisle with terrifying speed, raising the pen like a makeshift dagger aimed directly at my back. I turned just in time to see her charging, her eyes wide and feral. But before she could close the distance, the courtroom erupted into violent motion. A massive court bailiff intercepted her path. He hit Jessica with the force of a linebacker, brutally tackling her to the polished hardwood floor. The pen clattered harmlessly away. Jessica thrashed wildly, screaming and clawing at the officer, completely lost to her own hysteria. Deploying taser, the bailiff shouted, drawing his weapon and pressing it directly against her shoulder. The sharp crackle of electricity filled the air. Jessica's body instantly went rigid. Her eyes rolled back as the taser's high-voltage current locked her muscles, and she collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor like a discarded, broken marionette. The heavy metal pen she had intended to plunge into my neck skittered harmlessly under the plaintiff's table, spinning to a halt against the toe of my designer heel. Jessica lay there, twitching slightly, as two additional federal bailiffs descended upon her. They roughly wrenched her arms behind her back, snapping a heavy pair of steel handcuffs onto her wrists with a sharp, unforgiving click. The judge did not flinch. He leaned over the heavy wooden bench, his voice cutting through the residual shock in the room with absolute authority. Let the record reflect that the defendant, Jessica Harrington, has just committed a violent, premeditated assault in open court. Her probation is immediately and permanently revoked. She is remanded into federal custody to serve a minimum of 3 years alongside her mother. Get her out of my sight. Brenda let out a guttural, horrifying scream as she watched her golden child, the daughter she had worshipped and enabled for 3 decades, dragged away in chains. The two of them were forcefully marched out the side doors and loaded into the exact same armored transport van, bound for the exact same federal holding facility. They would spend the next several years sharing a concrete cell, locked together in the misery they had so meticulously cultivated. With his wife and favored daughter locked in federal prison and his fraudulent son-in-law facing 15 years of hard time, Richard was left entirely alone. The swift, merciless execution of my civil judgment had completely annihilated his financial safety net. The multi-million-dollar Oak Ridge estate was seized. His offshore accounts were frozen. The country club memberships, the luxury vehicles, the tailored suits, all of it evaporated into thin air. Richard was forced to pack what little clothing he had left into 2 cheap canvas bags and relocate to a state-subsidized low-income housing facility on the bleak, forgotten outskirts of the city. I received a comprehensive report from my private investigator detailing his new reality. The patriarch of the family, a man who once demanded imported scotch and prime rib, was now living in a 300-square-foot cinder-block room. His walls featured peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. The entire corridor smelled permanently of industrial bleach and boiled cabbage. He shared a communal bathroom down the hall and relied heavily on government food stamps to survive. He had absolutely nothing, and more importantly, he had absolutely no one to manipulate. He was a ghost haunting the linoleum hallways of a forgotten building. Knowing they were destroyed was not enough. I required absolute, impenetrable peace. I began methodically stripping every remaining trace of them from my existence. I contacted my cellular provider and completely disconnected my old phone number, permanently shutting down the line they had spammed with threats and pathetic weeping pleas. I purchased a secure encrypted device with a brand new number known only to my elite legal team, my financial advisors, and my closest corporate allies. There would be no more midnight voicemails. There would be no more desperate bargaining. Next, I overhauled the security protocols at Pinnacle Holdings. I handed the head of my security detail high-resolution photographs of Brenda, Richard, Jessica, and Marcus. Their faces were permanently flagged in our facial recognition software. I issued a strict zero-tolerance directive. If any of them set foot within a 100-foot radius of my corporate headquarters or my residential building, they were to be immediately detained by private security and arrested for criminal trespassing. I turned my daily life into an absolute untouchable fortress. The final step of my erasure was the most liberating. I stood before a civil court judge and formally petitioned to dissolve my legal connection to my abusers. I paid the filing fees, signed the heavy stack of documentation, and officially dropped the Harrington name. I reclaimed my autonomy, erasing the final linguistic chain that tied me to the people who had viewed me as nothing but a disposable asset. When the judge stamped the approval, I walked out of the courthouse as an entirely new entity. With my identity secured, I turned my attention to the ultimate symbol of my trauma, the Oak Ridge estate. I drove my custom town car up the long, winding driveway, parking in front of the massive double doors. The moving trucks had finished their job days ago. The house was entirely empty, echoing with the ghosts of 33 years of psychological warfare. I did not come to reminisce. I came to oversee the demolition. I hired a premium non-disclosure-bound contracting crew. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, holding a clipboard and pointed at the walls. I ordered the crew to strip every single ounce of Brenda's tacky, ostentatious floral wallpaper. I watched with deep, profound satisfaction as the workers took crowbars and sledgehammers to Richard's oppressive dark mahogany wood paneling in his study. The heavy wood splintered and cracked, tearing away the dark, suffocating aesthetic that had defined my miserable childhood. They ripped up the imported carpets, tore out the heavy velvet drapes, and shattered the gaudy crystal chandeliers. For 3 weeks, the house was a chaotic symphony of destruction and renewal. The crew stripped the estate down to its bare structural bones. They painted every wall a brilliant, crisp white. They sanded and refinished the original hardwood floors until they gleamed under the overhead lights. They installed massive modern windows that flooded the previously dark, suffocating rooms with brilliant natural sunshine. I erased their history from the very architecture of the building. When the dust finally settled, I walked through the pristine, echoing halls of the newly renovated estate. The air smelled of fresh paint and polished wood. The darkness was entirely gone. It was a beautiful, massive property, perfectly suited for a luxurious suburban life. But as I stood in the center of what used to be the living room, I realized something fundamental. I did not want it. I had my penthouse. I had my skyline view. I had no desire to live inside the walls where I had once cried myself to sleep, no matter how much fresh paint covered them. I did not need this monument to my victory. I reached into my tailored trench coat and pulled out a thick manila folder. Inside was a finalized property deed. I uncapped my fountain pen and pressed the sharp nib against the signature line. I was not selling the house. I was signing the entire multi-million-dollar estate over to a prominent domestic abuse nonprofit organization. I was turning the exact site of my childhood misery into a fully funded permanent sanctuary for women and children escaping toxic abusive environments. 6 months passed since I signed away the Oak Ridge estate. The transition from victim to victor was not merely a shift in circumstances, but a fundamental rewiring of my reality. I was no longer the discarded daughter or the convenient scapegoat. I was the architect of my own absolute triumph. I walked through the frosted glass doors of the first-class lounge at JFK International Airport. The atmosphere inside was a sanctuary of hushed conversations, clinking crystal, and the rich scent of artisanal espresso. I found a secluded leather armchair by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling tarmac where massive jets prepared to cross oceans. I set my vintage leather weekender bag on the polished table beside me. It was a beautiful handcrafted piece, a gift to myself to celebrate my latest and most significant professional milestone. My firm had not ignored the spectacular surgical precision with which I had dismantled Marcus Jenkins and his entire fraudulent enterprise. The senior partners had watched me recover my stolen assets, secure federal convictions for a syndicate of white-collar criminals, and emerge completely unscathed. They recognized that the ruthless efficiency I applied to my personal vindication was the exact weapon they needed in their corporate litigation arsenal. 3 weeks ago, I was unanimously voted in as a senior partner. I was handed the keys to a corner office overlooking the Boston Harbor, a massive increase in equity, and the absolute respect of every single attorney in the building. I had built an impenetrable fortress of success funded entirely by my own intellect and relentless drive. Meanwhile, the people who had tried to bury me were buried under the weight of their own consequences. Brenda and Jessica were currently navigating the brutal, unglamorous reality of federal prison, sharing a concrete cell and a metal toilet. Richard was wasting away in a subsidized housing unit entirely stripped of the wealth and status he had valued above human life. The contrast was not just poetic, it was absolute justice. I settled into the plush leather chair and ordered a glass of sparkling water with a twist of lemon. I opened my sleek silver laptop, intending to do a final sweep of my inbox before officially activating my out-of-office response. I had a flight to Paris boarding in less than an hour. I planned to spend 2 weeks wandering through art museums, eating fresh pastries along the Seine, and existing completely untethered from the heavy obligations of my past. I cleared my primary inbox, effortlessly responding to a few final congratulatory emails regarding my promotion. Out of sheer habit, I clicked over to my spam folder to empty the digital trash. My finger hovered over the trackpad. A single email sat at the very top of the filtered list. It was sent from an automated federal prison messaging system. The sender name was listed simply as Inmate Harrington Jessica. I stared at the screen. The spam filter had automatically flagged the automated prison domain, hiding it from my daily view. I clicked the subject line, allowing the plain text message to open on my screen. The formatting was blocky and crude, restricted by the prison's digital communication rules. The message was a frantic, desperate wall of text. Jessica had abandoned any pretense of arrogance or superiority. Her words reeked of sheer panic and pathetic manipulation. Harper, please, you have to read this. I know you hate me. I know I deserve it. But it is a nightmare in here. Mom is sick all the time and the medical staff does not care. The food is rotten. People are cruel. I have absolutely nothing. My commissary account is completely empty. I cannot even afford basic soap or a decent toothbrush. Richard will not answer my letters and he has no money anyway. You are the only one left who can help us. Please, Harper. I am begging you. Just put $500 on my books. I finally understand what family means. I finally understand that we should have protected each other. I am so sorry for everything. Please do not leave us in here to rot. You are my sister. I read the words twice, letting the full weight of her desperation settle into the quiet space around me. She was begging the very woman she had tried to stab with a metal pen in open court. She was appealing to a sense of familial duty that she and my mother had actively destroyed over 3 decades. She was using the word sister as a bargaining chip to secure basic toiletries. It was the ultimate display of her transactional hollow nature. I closed my eyes and waited for the familiar rush of anger. I waited for the residual sting of betrayal. I waited for the lingering guilt that victims are so often conditioned to feel when their abusers suffer. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no triumph in reading her pathetic pleas. There was no joy in her suffering, but there was also zero pity. The space inside my chest, where the desperate need for my family's love had once lived, was completely empty. It was not a cold, bitter emptiness. It was a clean, expansive, glorious nothingness. It was the profound peace of utter indifference. Jessica was no longer my sister. She was simply an inmate facing the reality of her own criminal choices. Her hunger, her discomfort, and her sudden convenient realization of family values were completely irrelevant to my existence. I did not type out a scathing reply. I did not demand further apologies. I did not send her a single dollar. I moved the cursor directly over the trash icon. I clicked the button marked Delete Forever. The screen flashed white for a fraction of a second before returning to an empty, pristine folder. The digital erasure was the final stroke of the physical and emotional erasure I had been executing for months. They were gone, completely and permanently deleted from the narrative of my life. I snapped the silver laptop shut and slid it into my bag. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored silk blouse. I picked up my vintage leather weekender, the weight of it grounding and satisfying in my hand. Flight Air France 023 to Paris. Charles de Gaulle is now boarding all first-class passengers. The overhead speaker chimed, the automated voice smooth and welcoming. I walked out of the lounge and down the bustling concourse. I approached the premium boarding lane, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, a rhythm of absolute autonomy. I handed my first-class boarding pass and my passport to the gate attendant. She scanned the document, smiling brightly. "Have a wonderful flight to Paris, Ms. Vance," she said, handing the documents back. "I absolutely will," I replied, returning her smile with genuine, unfiltered warmth. I walked down the long carpeted jet bridge, stepping onto the massive aircraft. I settled into my private suite, accepting a glass of vintage champagne from the flight attendant. As the plane taxied down the runway and the engines roared to life, I looked out the window at the receding American coastline. I was leaving the ashes of my toxic family an ocean away, and I was never looking back. The core lesson from these narratives is that your true worth is never determined by those who refuse to see it. Toxic family dynamics often trap us in a cycle of seeking validation from people actively trying to diminish our light. However, genuine power lies in quietly walking away and building your fiercely independent life. When you stop fighting for a seat at a table that disrespects you, you can finally build your own empire. The sweetest revenge is simply thriving on your own terms. Have you ever walked away from toxic relatives? Share your story in the comments below.